Okay.
Trying to get this sorted. It looks like Joe is talking, but I'm not hearing him.
I'm not hearing anyone either. Is Joe talking? I can't see him.
Oh, I can see his picture.
You can? I wonder if I'm logged in properly. Oh, there we are. Okay, I'm okay, better now.
You hear me now?
I can hear you now. How are we doing?
Good. So if Todd and Bud could come up on screen, that would be great.
Oh, okay, sorry, I'm not up on screen yet. I'm just working on that. There we are. Hey.
Where's Mr. Latham? So to all our speakers, hey, there's Todd.
Okay, I'm doing the standing thing, so I'm gonna just adjust my camera. There we go. How's that?
I'll do like the Brady Bunch, you know?
Who's there? Who's there? Hi, Angie.
Hi there, everyone.
What was what?
See how perhaps Todd's, yeah.
Can you turn your lights down at all, Todd?
Yeah.
You look like Casper the Ghost.
Okay. My lighting's okay?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Is that better? Or do you want me to go a little lighter or darker, I should say?
Just so everybody that's online knows, Todd's moderating. I'm going to throw it to Todd after I introduce Bud, and then I'll disappear, and then you can go from there. And a technician in the background will switch to each of the presenters when it's your turn to speak. You'll see a message on your screen when it's your turn to speak to say to share your desktop, and then you can go from there and share your presentation. Okay?
Okay, so Joe, I just do a 2-minute thing, right?
Yep.
It's all set.
And keep your company routine clean, please.
Yeah, okay, well, and Joe, for attending, I've just got to go in the other login method, right? Just to attend the session.
You can stay in there and listen from there.
Oh, okay, you saved me another step then, okay.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Joe, what about when we have two speakers? Because Grant Walsum and I are co-presenting. I know Jackie and Michelle are as well.
Both speakers be on screen, just someone control who's switching slides.
So will Grant and I both get the pop-up from the gentleman, the technician?
One of you will. One of you has to be the key presenter.
That's me, not Grant.
Okay. And Jacqueline, is it you or Michelle? Can't hear Jacqueline.
You're probably muted.
Matt Gardner.
So Matt and Jacqueline. Okay.
Matt and Jacqueline will be the. Yeah.
Okay, good. Right on. And where did Todd go? Todd, just so you know, Angie's talk is about 10 to 15 minutes, right, Angie?
Yep, that's great.
Okay, I'm not gonna read anybody's bios. I'm just gonna let everybody
Just tell
know
them
that
they're
they're
in the program and we'll go from there.
Yeah. Is there anything other special instructions in terms of opening this one up? Or Bud's gonna start and then
I'll just turn it over to you after I do some opening and introduce Bud, and then when Bud's done, you can take over.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Hey, this is Brian Lambert. I'm just checking my audio. Can
Yeah, you're
everyone
good,
hear
Brian.
me?
Yeah, you're good, Brian. Can't hear Jacqueline.
Hi, Jackie. Can't hear you.
I think she says, I can read Jackie's sign language. She says that on your end, you need to unmute her, she thinks.
Oh, okay, just a second. Oh,
Okay.
There we go.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes,
Yeah, we
you
can
are.
hear you now.
Perfect.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Great.
She can tell them they can go live if they want. Yeah.
Okay, we can go live into that room now.
You guys go live. We're going to go live for 2 minutes and just let people gather in. We'll come back in 2 minutes and get started. And you might get muted and you might disappear.
So maybe we should put up while we're waiting for this to start, the session slide with the ID logo. Thank you. Yep.
It's my desktop.
Oh, that's Joe's.
Yeah.
There's a slide there.
you have speaking notes for me? I forgot to print them. Is there any notes for this? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, okay. Joe's gonna do it from his computers. Oh, there he is. Okay.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed our opening session. It's now time for our regulatory and legal update session. Our moderator for the entire session will be Todd Latham, a good friend of ISA, great supporter of RemTech since day one. So Todd from Actual Media will be the moderator. But before we get started, we have a message from the session sponsor, Ivy International. Bud, are you there?
I think I'm there. Can you hear me, Joe?
We can.
Okay, I'm going to give a brief few slides. Here we go. First, I'd like to say thanks for the opportunity to be a sponsor for RemTech this year. It means a lot to me, and very much like you can see me, right, Joe?
Yes, we can, Bud.
Okay, yeah, no, just something weird happened on my screen, that's all. Okay, anyways, we've been empowering remediation for over 25 years. Just want to thank ISA and RemTech for being around, and something that's not well known by a lot of people. I've actually made it to every one of these things since the very beginning, so it's a good thing to be involved with, and Todd's been around for many of them and almost as many as I have. A little bit about Ivy, for those that don't know, we've been around for actually 26 years now. We're a Western Canadian company. We're very well known for being an international award-winning company for developing innovative patented products, including Ivy Sol, surfactant remediation technology, and a newer product called Deconit for decontaminating a lot of field equipment. Could be above ground storage tank pipelines and things like that. We've also developed a great reputation working globally for improving physical, biological, and chemical remediation and treating a lot of petroleum, chlorinated, PFAS, organometallic contaminants in soil and groundwater to the benefit of our clients. So we've actually been powering remediation for over 25 years. Really quickly about me, I get jokingly picked on by some people in the States. They call me Walter from Breaking Bad because I found ways of changing chemical behavior to get things that don't want to dissolve in water, to get water to flow in fine-grained soils, and again, improving that physical, biological, and chemical remediation by breaking the rules of chemistry. A lot of that's to do with my background in organic chemistry and geological engineering, giving me a very multidisciplinary background. Doing this for over 25 years. I've been on for 2,500 projects globally, taking me to 55 countries. In addition to holding several international patents, we've won many awards. I've even completed an Ironman. Yeah, that's kind of fun. A little bit about us visually, just showing us taking free product and getting it dissolved, to chlorinated solvents to sink to make them dissolve, to taking highly contaminated soils, on the bottom left there, frac sand, and getting that cleaned, to surfactant-enhanced bioremediation like F3, F4 contamination in Alberta, to soil washing with some of our clients. We were very proud to receive the top 10 Environmental Technology Solution Provider Award in June of this year, the United States. That was great. And I'll close with just saying I want you to have a great RemTech and wish you, your families, and friends a healthy and prosperous year, and looking forward to a great 2020. And these are just some of the companies that we've collaborated with, both here domestically in Canada, United States, but also in several foreign countries. So thank you for this opportunity, Joe.
Hi, everybody. I'm Todd Latham, as Bud's already introduced, and thank you, Bud, for that introduction. It is unfortunate that we're not all there together in Banff to meet and do RemTech live. Normally, I'd be running around right now with a camera, taking pictures of you guys and taking pictures of our keynote. So I miss doing the happy snaps, but right on the top of your screen, you see a screenshot. So use that screenshot throughout RemTech today and tomorrow. to capture the images of the speakers and share them on social media, hashtag ESA RemTech, as you all know. So moving right into things, we have 10 speakers today. First off is Angie Hook, Vice President of Marketing Customer Engagement of Eco Canada. All the bios are in the program, so I'm not going to read them out to you. Please just look at the program and enjoy with your sweatpants and loafers, as Fred says. So over to you, Angie.
Awesome. Thank you, Todd, for that introduction. Just going to get there we go, so that you can see me. And just let me take a second here to pull up my my screen. Okay. Whoops. Sorry, guys, just bear with me a moment here. All right. All right, can everybody see my screen?
Angie, if you click the top left where it says display settings.
Okay.
Yeah, but you got split screen.
Oh, I did, yeah. Yeah, it was trying to work with her.
You see that it says show taskbar display settings and slideshow.
Mm-hmm.
If you click display settings.
She can see the full screen.
Oh, okay. Okay, just go ahead.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I just want to take a few minutes today before we get into the meat of the other presentations to share a little bit about the environmental employment outlook in Canada. We just released some new research around the latest labor market insights, and so I think this is quite timely with everything that's been going on in the world today, and want to share with you guys some of the highlights of that research. All right, so just a little bit about Eco Canada. We are the steward for the Canadian environmental workforce across industries. We not only train and certify environmental professionals, but as I mentioned, we also spend a lot of time identifying labor market gaps. And it's our mandate and job to excel in providing tailored HR solutions from the learnings of those labor market gaps. And you know, now more than ever, Canadians are asking for accountability, and they expect corporations, brands, and industry to be good environmental citizens. So given the collective focus on better standards and accountability, environmental jobs are on the upward growth trend, and that's not going away, despite some of the things that we're seeing currently with all the impacts of COVID. So just to give some context to the data on the next few slides that I'm going to share, the environmental workforce has evolved over the years and can be defined by two core classification streams: core environmental workers and goods and services workers. So core practitioners work in occupations requiring specialized environmental skills and training. Those skills fit into the over 300 competencies that are outlined in the National Occupation Standards. And these guys participate in any industry or occupation. So it could be, for example, a civil engineer that's employed by a construction company. Whereas goods and services workers are employed by firms classified under the goods and services subsector, regardless of whether the role requires specific environmental competencies. It's much broader in role contribution to the workforce. Someone in this specific area, an example might be an accountant that's employed by a cleaning supplies manufacturer. So today I'm primarily going to focus on the employment trends for these core workers. This is kind of the snapshot of what we've learned over the last little while in you know, analyzing our environmental workforce data. though many industries and job markets are expected to take longer to recover from the impacts of COVID, the environmental workforce is expected to rebound more quickly, which is great. We just published the report, which includes a lot more detail about these results that I'll get into, but we know that there are roughly around 600,000 environmental workers as of 2019. This means that 1 in 30 Canadian workers have an environmental role, and you know, there's an 8% growth projected in new jobs and new green jobs that we're hoping to see by 2029, which means that there's roughly you know, over 50,000 new jobs that are going to need to be filled in the next decade. That's going to increase the overall you know, employment rate around the 670,000 mark. Which is really exciting to see. However, we're also seeing a mass exodus of the baby boomer trend. 30% of this 600,000 are expected to retire in the next 10 years. So that's about 183,000 retiree gap, which is fairly substantial and something more I'll talk about in a minute. But as a result, we're looking at just over 250,000 net new jobs by 2029. So with that 250,000 jobs, you know, between new roles and demand and the replacement demand, the environmental workforce is one of the fastest growing employment sectors in Canada. And the change, you know, this is really good to see, because we know with, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty and nervousness around what's happening right now with COVID, but, you know, when we look at the longer trend, it's you know, it's actually quite promising. So diving down a little bit into some of the more regional statistics, this is a snapshot of the map of Canada by and showing sort of the total employment in 2019. You'll see in the darker gray and the lighter gray is the total environmental employment in 2019, and then that green bar is the share, so just the percentage share, environmental share that's been calculated based on those two top statistics. And this shows you a drill down of the you know, the total environmental workforce across Canada and where those concentrations exist. So it's not surprising to see Ontario and Quebec are you know, leading the way in terms of volume of employment versus environmental employment. What's interesting is that the enviro share percentage in the territories is quite a bit higher than the average, which is roughly around 3% when you kind of look at all the rest of the regions in Canada. Based on those regional baselines for 2019, this map illustrates what the breakdown is in terms of job growth expected by 2019 in those regions. Every province and territory will be looking for workers, but by volume alone, Ontario is expected to take the majority of job openings, accounting for nearly 40% of total openings. The province is working toward upskilling the current workforce and attracting more people to the building sector and low carbon construction. So we think that's going to be a, you know, a big driver, you know, within that area. And we're seeing in Quebec as well, I wanted to point that out again, that, you know, being the second largest province, you know, and they are actually the second largest provincial employer of environmental work. What's interesting there, though, is that 9 in every 10 jobs that are projected to be created in the next 10 years are going to come from workforce retirement. Our research indicates that reducing use of plastics, you know, repurposing recycled materials, and sustainably managing their own natural resources are top areas of focus for those enviro jobs within the province of Quebec. Also, you can see that Alberta and BC are, you know, expected to see some higher employment demand as well, which is great. Business investment, government initiatives, you know, financing. There's a few things that are primary promoters for the environmental jobs that you see across the rest of Canada. So let's take a closer look at the subsector areas where job growth exists. Of those 233,000 or 250,000 job openings I've mentioned that are in total are expected, close to half are going to be for core workers. those who require some technical specialty, that can work across industries, that's going to be, a real big driver of that employment growth, looking for those folks who have that specialized skill but can transition, across industry. Approximately 111,000 core workers are going to be needing to be hired, in the next 10 years in one of these kind of 6 areas. So, majority of the hiring will come from replacement demand within this core worker group. In fact, it's about 78% of that total that will be driven by retirement. So the convergence of, market, regulatory, social, and technological factors are, heavy influencers for the number and type of environmental workers that are needed today and in the future. Climate change, the demand for green solutions and financing opportunities, to undertake environmental work are some of the top factors, but there are several others that are driving higher job growth rates in these 6 subsectors or areas of practice. The green or blue mandates that we're hearing a lot about, are also going to help boost activity within nature conservation and water quality, as well as clean and sustainable technology adoption. Canada's shift to a low carbon economy is another driver that's increasing the need for high performance building and sustainable transportation, and that's only expected to grow. So when you look further drilling down past that into, where are these jobs? What are the occupations that we're seeing where a lot of this growth is expected to happen? So this is a snapshot of the top 10 occupation sets based on the research. We're seeing that almost 70% of all the openings are going to be in those top 3 areas: management, natural and applied sciences, as well as business, finance, and admin. You see that the dark black bar there is showing what the expansion demand will be. So that means new jobs, net new jobs that are created as a result of some of those mandates that I mentioned previously. But this green bar is where we're seeing a lot of it, of the trend, which is that retirement trend that's really shaping why there's such an exponential growth that we're expecting to see in the next 10 years. A lot of folks are expected to exit the profession, which isn't a shock, but and it's something that we've talked about as well for the last few years. And what we're seeing is that is expected to accelerate. Most of these other areas that you see are, there's a fairly substantial kind of variation between the retirement and the net new jobs. However, if you look at health occupations, it's almost an even split. With the increase around regulatory, and compliance practice, we're expecting to see there be, an interesting little growth trend there with new jobs in health occupations. Core workers, when you look at the top green occupations, core workers are key to advancing the green economy and meeting those values-driven environmental targets. Concentrated within 60 occupational classifications. I'm not going to show all of those, obviously. This screenshot is really just showing those top 5 areas of where the growth is happening, and it's substantial. When we look at the top 5, it's around 46% of the total core workers that are in Canada are kind of fitting in one of these areas. What's interesting when you look at this is the forestry professionals have the highest enviro share, but will only account for an additional 1,100 net new jobs by 2029. Whereas if you look at volume, engineers, engineers are kind of both within each set of data by employment size as well as enviro share, and they represent a significant portion of both areas. Collectively, engineering occupations are expected to account for more than 23,000 net job openings by 2029, and this is in addition to the over 32,000 employment roles that you currently see here. Top provinces that are expected to offer engineering opportunities, course, they're going to align with where those, regions in Canada already employ a lot of environmental workers. Ontario, Alberta, and BC specifically are areas where we see growth opportunities for those engineering occupations. The growing need for sustainable infrastructure, site assessment and remediation, and the adoption of low carbon designs, technologies, and materials used in construction are probably the key drivers of this engineering employment trend. So while other markets may face long recoveries ahead, our forecasts indicate that environmental employment demand is expected to persevere with, substantial hiring needs expected in this decade. Every region of Canada will need workers. The growth will be led by Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta primarily. But what I wanted to kind of share is, what this means for some of the key stakeholder groups that we specifically work with, and the ones that are really going to shape and influence these trends. So for employers, attracting, retaining, developing talent, it's important. It's important to look at HR strategies to ensure that succession planning and other training opportunities are made available. Project-based organizations may see the greatest impacts if these areas are not considered because of the risk of lower or less available subject matter expertise. That can be really critical to onboarding new clients and new business. Educators, I mean, they have a job to do, a role to fill in terms of ensuring that our recent new graduates are prepared. Continuing education programs, same thing, making sure that everything that they're teaching are relevant to the work being done across industry, and preparing those emerging practitioners and students with not only technical foundations, but also those life skills that will help put these guys on the path to take on more senior roles and business related responsibilities that are becoming more and more important for employers. And then, we have the practitioners as well. These are, the folks who are, there's a lot of opportunity, I think, that this information presents, not only for folks that are currently in the workforce, but those that are transitioning or maybe struggling in some of the industries or subsectors that are more challenged right now. I think that these takeaways are exciting, and they're empowering if there's a commitment to lifelong learning, and the fact that there are new challenges across industry to tackle, job opportunities in every region, and a constant, change in the environmental workforce. That's always been there, and it presents a lot of great career opportunity, I think, for that particular area. So just a few available resources that we also offer to kind of, we always want to make sure at Eco Canada that we're using these findings to ensure our programs are aligned with the current workforce trends. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about our employment programs. These are a win-win, both for new practitioners as well as employers. Right now, we're currently, we have two programs, one for student work placement funding. This is a great program that provides up to $5,000 per placement. And there's not usually a limit of the number of placements that an employer can do with this program. It's quite flexible. We've seen some great success with employers onboarding students who are hungry and eager to learn. We also have a newer wage funding program called Digital Skills for Youth, and this is a bit newer for us. It's focusing on digital skill development and offers up to $22,000 per placement, and that is for both wages as well as equipment or training to facilitate that digital skill adoption and support businesses that are looking to shift operations to become more automated or more accurate. And we also offer custom recruiting and HR support for employers that might be struggling to find qualified candidates or looking for some more support in implementing their people management practices. Professional development, again, I'm sure most of you have likely heard of the EP designation, which is a great way to tackle those lifelong learning commitments that I mentioned before. We also offer a range of workshops and continuing ed opportunities. Normally we host a lot of in-person events, and I have to say we are really itching to get back out there and travel because we miss seeing everyone face to face. But this year we're flipping some of those opportunities to virtual, so definitely check that out if you have a chance. I'm going to stop and hand it back over to Todd, but if you have any questions about the data that I shared, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is there. as well as the full research report is available on the homepage of our website if you'd like to take a look at that. Thank you so much for your time today, and hope everybody is doing well, staying healthy, happy, and I'm excited going into this fall season.
Sorry, Angie, I was just taking some pictures for the happy chat, snapshots there. Thanks very much for your presentation. Now we have some time for questions and answers, of course. Don't see any on there, but as you know, there's a little button there. You can ask a question and I will help read it out. And in the meantime, while we're waiting for people to
There's a
chime
question in
in.
there, Todd.
Okay, don't see that, but
I can ask it. Angie, for graduate students in the environmental space, what technical skills and soft skills, just a second, sorry, and soft skills should students make sure to develop to make sure they can participate in a growing environmental space?
Yeah, that's a good question, definitely. You know, we've found that, you know, the technical skills are a great foundation for these emerging graduates, but there's a lot of, you know, kind of gap in terms of their barrier in being able to acquire meaningful work. A lot of the reason is because of those soft skills, having, you know, strong communication skills, being able to conduct yourself professionally in the workplace can sometimes be a challenge. And so there are a lot of those areas that we also look at: leadership development and project management, communications, as I mentioned, being big areas of opportunity for students. And like I mentioned, the lifelong learning aspect, whether you are in the environmental sector or not, I think that's a really important thing these days to pay attention to. And I think it makes you a more well-rounded person.
okay, well, I have one for you, Angie. You mentioned business, finance, and admin was number 3 on demand. Curious, does that cover communications? Because you mentioned you're also your youth digital program. So is part of the demand the top 3, including environmental communications?
Definitely. Yeah, Todd, that's right. It's what we're seeing is that there's a lot of really smart, technically minded folks in Canada that have great ideas, great innovations, but you know, we really struggle as a nation to commercialize those ideas and take credit for them and make it commercially sound, you know, channel. And so I think that's where there's the opportunity, where we're seeing these growth in business, finance, and admin, is how do we take all of this talent, you know, that we're building, and all of these services and the innovations, and bring this to market and make this a viable, you know, solution, and put Canada really on a global scale as a leader in commercialization.
Thanks for that. We do have another question. What kind of timelines can employers request funding for co-op students?
So we're still accepting placements, I believe, for the fall as well as for the winter semester. My suggestion is just to get your application in as soon as you can. It's really easy. It takes 20 minutes to put your application together, and our team is pretty responsive. They'll get back to you right away and let you know the next steps. But there's a lot of funding still available for the student placement program. The digital skills for youth program I mentioned is limited. It's been very successful the last 30 days, and so we don't have a lot of placements left with that one. If you are interested, make sure you get your application in ASAP.
Okay, I have another one. I'm really curious about the 600, based on what your presentation, there's about 600,000 individuals in Canada who are part of the environment industry. Is that correct? First of all, I just did the numbers in the back of an envelope here.
Yeah, it's 620,000 roughly individuals that are employed in environmental work in Canada. As I mentioned, there's a split. We split between core workers and goods and services workers, but it's close to half that would be, you know, a lot of the folks that are attending this conference today would be considered those core workers. It's substantial. It's 1 in 30. That's you know, that's not a number to sneeze at.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of projecting the future, where have we come? What was the number, say, 5 years ago, and what do you think that number will be 5 years in the future?
We've seen a lot of flux within the trends that we've analyzed over the last few years. There's been a lot of, redefining what is the difference between a core worker and a goods and services worker. I guess back in the day, there were a lot of people that could be considered part of the environment who's, might be the receptionist of the company, and part of your job is making sure the recycling goes out, but that isn't really, something that would be considered core to environmental practice. So that's really evolved over the years. We've seen definitely a growth in those core worker roles. There's a lot more demand for like I said, those folks who have a technical specialization but can work across industry. And we're, depending on how these, the mandate goes for the green economy, the blue economy, all of these things are as I said, if people want accountability from corporations and business. So, we expect to see that number definitely to remain very stable or even continue to grow.
Okay, we have one final question before we go to our next speaker. How would you see the market for professionals that have a doctoral degree, i.e. the transition from academia to the industry?
So, I mean, anybody that has, that level of expertise, I think there's a lot of, room for them to play within the space. There's a lot of opportunity in terms of public awareness and education. The need right now to bring real sound education to the masses as well, to help them understand that it's, there's a place for sustainable economic growth in Canada. And that's where we want to kind of present that model. Is it's, we definitely see the value in, the folks that are more on the conservation side and the things they're doing more from an activism standpoint. But I think that there's an opportunity now to bring those other folks to the table who are working within those industries that might typically have been seen as non-environmental. That's a great place, I think, for those highly educated folks to help support the education and public awareness of this.
Well, thank you very much, Angie. Great presentation. I'm sure it'll be shared via the recording. And if you want more information, contact Angie directly or through Joe. We're going to move right on to our next speaker. Thank you again, Ivy Soul, for sponsoring this session. We have Brian Lambert, Alberta Environment and Parks, who is going to be audio only. And presenting with Brian is Marcus Thorman of Matrix Solutions. So over to you guys.
Thanks, Todd. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm going to fire up the presentation. Can you see that okay? Does it look weird? I have two monitors, so sometimes it looks wonky. We good? Okay, I'm going to start rolling then.
Brian's Joe, we can see your email.
My email? What the heck?
We can see your desktop.
Oh, weird. Why is it not? I have the thing showing.
You just might have to open it again.
Okay. Hang on.
Sorry.
Okay.
Please bear with us, everyone. The fun of live online.
Oh, show my screen. There we go. How about now?
All right, success.
Great success. All right.
Brian, can you see a button top left says display settings?
You bet.
Click that, swap presenter views, and then we can see full screen. There we go. Thank you.
Aces. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, big thanks to Joe and Stacy and all the ESAA staff and board for keeping the ball rolling and reuniting everyone this year. Also, thanks to Lorene Hamden, Fred Keating, and Brian Keating. And I want to give a shout out and say thanks to Doug Keys, Margaret Allen, and my co-presenter, Dr. Marcus Thorman from Matrix Solutions. And also want to say thanks to Laurie Brendred and everyone at ATCO Electric and Brendan Jones from AltaLink. And thanks to some of my co-workers, Susan McGillivray, Gordon Dinwiddie, Shane Patterson, Kyle Jones, and other folks at AEP. And thank you to Todd and the ESA sponsors and all the other panelists. We are rolling. So the reclamation practices and criteria, they are for operators and qualified environmental professionals when you're removing power lines and decommissioning infrastructure, and for reclaiming and assessing power line right-of-ways and associated lands. For power lines, for the purpose of conservation and reclamation, the 2010 reclamation criteria for well sites and associated facilities provide the context for how final reclamation success is determined and at the time of the RecCert application. So I'll be referring to that as just reclamation criteria. Some people call it well site criteria, but basically it covers everything. And if you ever talk to us and you need some kind of rec criteria, that's probably what we'll refer you to. So as we know, power lines have some unique features that affect how the reclamation criteria can be applied. Power lines typically are linear disturbances and have some associated infrastructure, and they can cover multiple properties and various land types. Power line right-of-ways often impact wetlands, and that presents some unique challenges for decommissioning and subsequent reclamation and assessments. However, the basic principles of soil, landscape, and vegetation reclamation they're fairly universal in nature. So for associated facilities such as substations and any other nonlinear facilities, the REC criteria may be applied exactly as they are applied to well sites. For power lines and for the purpose of conservation and reclamation, like I said, the 2010 REC criteria is what you would refer to. So transmission lines are considered specified land under the conservation and reclamation regulation. Therefore, transmission lines on both private and public land must be reclaimed and obtain a reclamation certificate. Transmission lines must be reclaimed to equivalent land capability by meeting REC criteria for landscape, soils, and vegetation, like I mentioned before. Distribution lines on public lands must also be reclaimed, and that's as per the Public Lands Act. Holders of a distribution line disposition must reclaim and obtain a letter of clearance for disposition closure. Distribution lines on public land must be reclaimed to equivalent land capability by meeting REC criteria. Same thing for landscape, soils, and vegetation, similar to those requirements for transmission lines. And while they are distribution lines are not specified land, under the Public Lands Act and the Public Lands Administration Regulation, at the time of closure, they must follow and achieve all reclamation requirements, such as those that are described in this guide that we're talking about today. And they must also meet all additional requirements and terms within the formal disposition or easement, and that must be met as part of the application. And you can't just merely report that you did a DSA and that you met REC criteria. So if anyone remembers, sometimes time seems like it drags, and other times it seems like it's flying by in these days. But the guide did come out. It was published May 29th, 2020. And if you want to find a copy of it, probably the easiest way is just search for REC practices and criteria for power lines, and you'll find it in the government, like the open library system. You can download it there. So a reclamation certificate or letter of clearance on public land, the applications are prepared and submitted. They must be done and signed off by qualified environmental professionals. And we've talked about it before. If you've ever read any of our documents, you've probably seen the blurbs we put in. So they have to meet professional competencies from things like professional agrologists, biologists, engineers, geoscientists, chemical professionals, forest management professionals, and science and engineering professional technologists. Competent practitioners working with a coordinating qualified environmental professional, they can sign off and complete appropriate components of the work as directed under the Joint Practice Standard, the 2012 one. In circumstances involving wetlands, an authenticating wetland professional must meet all the stipulations outlined in the Professional Practice Standard. So Alberta's land use framework sets out regional land use plans for land use management and decision making on the landscape. Operators must be aligned with regional and sub-regional plans and meet objectives and legislation and regulations, such as some stuff already talked about, like the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act, the Water Act, the Weed Control Act, water regulation, the CNR regulation, public lands admin regulation, and the Code of Practice for power line works impacting wetlands, and also any regional and local planning requirements, so things like municipal bylaws and zoning. For directives and standards and criteria, operators must also follow regulatory and policy guidance such as directives, standards, criteria, codes of practice, and best management practices. So things like the 2010 reclamation criteria, the wetland mitigation directive, the Wetland Identification and Delineation Directive, conservation assessments in native grasslands and strategic siting for pre-disturbance assessments, and wildlife directives for both Alberta wind energy projects and maybe solar energy projects. So some things, some best management practices: having a qualified environmental professional on site during conservation and reclamation activities such as salvaging and placement of materials. You need to be adaptive and evolve continually as additional learnings, monitoring, and research are incorporated, because you want to prevent and reduce potential adverse impacts, and you're always targeting towards your site-specific concerns throughout the life cycle of your project. So some things to keep in mind: club route management, management practices for renewable energy projects and native grasslands, parklands and wetland ecosystems, recovery strategies for industrial developments, and minimizing site or surface disturbances on native grasslands. So a summary of power line reclamation and regulatory closure requirements based on land type. Private land, operators of transmission lines must reclaim and apply for a reclamation certificate. Operators of distribution lines should reclaim, but do not need to apply for a regulatory closure unless the distribution line is part of a larger activity considered specified land. On public land, operators of transmission lines must reclaim and apply for a reclamation certificate. And operators of distribution lines on public land must reclaim and apply for a letter of clearance. One thing to note, people wonder transmission lines versus distribution lines. So transmission lines and their associated facilities are sometimes downgraded or reassigned as distribution lines. However, if a site or a portion of a site is used or has ever been used as part of a transmission line or associated facility, which are defined as specified land, the site will remain as specified land and therefore must still be reclaimed to equivalent land capability, and a reclamation certificate or letter of clearance needs to be obtained. That's it for me. If you have questions, well, we can wait till the end, but that's my email if anybody ever wants to hit me up. So next should be Marcus. Thanks.
I hope everybody can hear me.
Yep.
And hopefully see my screen too.
Yeah, we can see you and see your screen. You just need to put up your presentation.
Excellent, I'm working on that. So how do I do that? Sharing. Show my screen.
Yep.
And hopefully you can see it all now.
Great, perfect, thank you.
Excellent, thank you. I thank exactly the same people that Brian thanked. And I thank Brian for covering the first few pages of the new document that came out earlier this year. And I want to get into some of the remaining meat of that document. I know we've all seen power lines in the countryside. They come in different shapes and sizes. They range from single poles, which are typically constructed of or made out of wood or metal. They may have guy wires attached to them as well, especially at turning locations. There's also H frames that are a little bit more complicated, double the footprint. The additional materials here include composite materials in addition to the wood and the metal. They may also have guy wires and structures or foundational support structures in the ground that you can't see. And the most complicated or complex ones of these transmission lines or power lines are these steel lattice structures, which always have concrete foundations. They're freestanding, but they may also have some guy wires attached to them. Ultimately, these will all have to be decommissioned and reclaimed towards a reclamation certificate or a clearance letter. But during the operational lifespans of these structures, they are being maintained both structurally and from a vegetation perspective below as well. Typically, larger plant species get removed or managed in such a way that they don't interfere with the cables above. At the end of the lifespan, they have to be removed and reclaimed, which typically includes the removal of all the equipment, all the infrastructure, and all the materials that made up that particular structure. And that may include below ground anchoring structures such as the guy wires, footers, or the concrete structures in the ground below the poles that you see above ground. Needless to say, one size does not fit all. These These structures are located in uplands and wetlands. From an upland perspective, that includes cultivated lands, native grasslands, or forests. And in wetlands, we're dealing with either mineral wetlands or peatlands, those wetlands that accumulate organic soils. And the decommissioning and reclamation has to be tailored to the land and the physical environment that these structures are sitting in. What's critically important here is that before the decommissioning reclamation starts, that you do some planning on the ground. This can be in an office or on the ground to see where your right-of-way is located, what it's crossing, what kind of ecosystems and terrains are impacted. And that'll help you down the road once you do your detailed site assessments to avoid having any delays in achieving a reclamation criteria or getting a reclamation certificate. As the saying goes, do early planning against a reclamation certificate in this case. Some of the issues that you will be encountering or may be encountering when decommissioning and reclaiming these power lines are roadways or access trails to and from the right-of-way that are considered disturbed lands. While you're driving to and from these structures to remove the structures, you may be you may have to deal with soil compaction, especially if you're dealing in wetlands that are wet for varying parts of the year. There may be poor vegetation regrowth. On steeper slopes, you might be dealing with erosion issues, soil erosion or soil losses. Once a removed structure or area has been backfilled, there may be soil subsidence and pooling of water. That's also not desirable, especially in agricultural settings. You may not have enough topsoil for backfilling. If you have a large structure to remove, there's no huge sense in creating another hole to fill this hole. So there may be lack of topsoil that's adequate from a quality perspective and quantity perspective. If you're overfilling the hole, you may have gravel at the surface, also not desirable. And needless to say, these are disturbed areas for some time after reclamation, after removal of the structure, and you'll be dealing with some noxious and prohibited noxious weeds, which are regulated under the Alberta Weed Act and regulation. I'll talk about upland power pole structure or power line structure removal strategies first. Typically, or generally, everything has to be removed, including the structures in the soil, although in some cases, some of those structures, the support structures, the concrete footers can remain in place, in which case you have to remove everything above ground to a depth of about 4 feet. And you have to get an approval from the regulator, such as the public lands officer and the landowner, to leave the structure in place. Now that you have removed the structure, you need to backfill it as well, and preferably you use sand for that, although gravel is acceptable. You backfill to about 0.5 meter or just a touch under 2 feet below the ground surface, and then the rest has to be filled with topsoil that is preferably from a local source and of similar soil quality. And that simply ensures that revegetation is going to be successful and speedy. Speaking of vegetation establishment, preferably, you don't have to do an awful lot, especially if it's a small footprint that has been disturbed. Natural encroachment is quite efficient in many wetlands and uplands as well, but you may have to do some assistance there and do some seeding and planting, especially in areas where you have high soil erosion potentials. And cultivated lands, you don't have to do any seeding there because the landowner is going to be taking care of that the following year. From a wetland perspective, things get a little bit trickier. Just as a quick primer here, there's 5 different wetland classes in Alberta, and all wetlands, all natural wetlands are protected under the Water Act and do require an approval under the Water Act before you can go in there and do any work. That work needs to be supervised or done by, as Brian mentioned, an authenticating wetland professional. That's a requirement for the Water Act application and approval process as well. Two of these five wetland classes are hydrologically very variable, fens and marshes, and that creates some special conditions and requirements in regards to reclamation of these power pole structures from these types of wetlands. Mineral wetlands are those that typically have very little to no organic soils anywhere in them, and that typically includes marshes, shallow open water wetlands, and swamps. Although, as I mentioned, there are some marshes that have peat as well. It's just a different material that makes it up. And marshes and some swamps are hydrologically very variable. So if you're dealing with ephemeral and temporary wetlands, which would have been classified as Class 1 or Class 2 wetlands under the Stewart and Cadwood Wetland Classification System from 1971, you can go in there and remove those structures year-round. They're going to be dry most likely by the time you get to them. Seasonal wetlands or Class 3 wetlands, they will likely be dry in midsummer and thereafter you can do the work, the reclamation and construction work in summer, fall, or winter. Again, being cognizant of hydrologic conditions, because after heavy rainfall, they may be wet too. Semi-permanent and permanent wetlands, or class 4 and class 5 wetlands, you should only be doing this work in the winter when it's frozen. As mentioned previously as well, in the uplands, some support or anchoring structures can remain on the soil, but that should not be the rule, it should only be the exception, and your wetland authenticating professional is going to provide guidance on that, or should provide guidance on that. In some instances, you can leave the wooden poles inside and support structures in the wetland. Just cut it off and put a bird nest on top of it or something like that. So there are options to utilize these structure remnants for other purposes as well. Backfilling may or may not be required. If you're removing the structure from a wetland that has a lot of water in it, you actually do not want to backfill, just leave it the way it is. It'll fill in eventually by itself. So that's particularly relevant for semi-permanent and permanent wetlands. The other wetland types or classes under the marsh wetland classification system, seasonal, temporary, and ephemeral wetlands, you will very likely have to backfill because they're going to be dry by the time you do the work in them. Similar to the uplands, natural encroachment of the vegetation is going to occur in most instances, but you may have to do some seeding as well, depending on how big the impact was to those mineral wetlands. So that's again site-specific and not a general rule, and can be applied across all mineral wetlands. The organic soil wetlands or peatlands, in this case bogs and fens, the work should only be done in the winter months when it's frozen. That'll reduce vegetation impacts. Those types of wetlands are very difficult to reclaim and rehabilitate, so do this work under frozen soil conditions. Backfillings, just like before, may or may not be necessary. If you do have to do some backfilling, try to source some local materials. Anything like tree trunks, branches, can be just stuffed into the hole, and the vegetation will come back naturally fairly quickly in most of these wetlands, and probably 2 or 3 years later you won't even know there was anything there in the first place. Again, with the caveat attached that in some instances you may want to do some plantings of shrubs and trees to encourage the more efficient vegetation reestablishment process. So now that you've done this and you've looked at this site and everything looks fine, you'll get to the detailed site assessment phase, or the DSA. As part of this process, you'll be looking at soil quality and quantity, looking at soil profiles to see how things look below ground as well in the reclamation area. You look at the terrain. Is the water flowing left or right the way it should be? Are there any slumping, water pooling on the soil that needs to be dealt with? What does the vegetation look like? Are there weeds, and how many weeds are there, and what kind of weeds are there? Do they need to be regulated and managed? In an agricultural setting, can the farmer grow his crops there? So that needs to be looked at. Other factors here, and I'll put a nod to the wildlife people. There may be stick nests nearby that need to be considered, or dens of wildlife that all need to be looked at and considered as part of the DSA process. As mentioned previously, there are different criteria for the DSA process. There's specific guidelines for cultivated lands, forest lands, native grasslands, and wetlands. And technically, every area that has been touched by the pole structure and the equipment getting to and from the pole structure, including the right-of-way and access roads, are considered disturbed areas and need to be assessed. Bare areas after some time, especially during the DSA stage, are acceptable, especially if the area is less than about a meter in diameter. If the soil still is of sufficient quality to facilitate revegetation, that's good too. If you see some plants showing up in that disturbed area, that's good as well. And in cultivated areas, you can't have any bare areas. It has to be fully vegetated the following year. Just like most areas that need to be assessed for reclamation or vegetation health, you have to have a paired sampling approach here when you're looking at vegetation health. For example, you have your impacted area, the right-of-way in this case, and a control area that needs to be nearby to act as a proper control area. The sampling intensity depends on the length of the right-of-way. If you have a 20-30 kilometer long right-of-way, you're not going to be assessing every square foot of that. You can pick representative structures or areas of structures and do your DSA process there, inspections there. The remainder of the right-of-way and the access roads can be assessed visually from the air, for example. You can use a drone or fly it with a helicopter. That's entirely up to you. Sampling plots typically are circular, but they can be rectangular or square as well. It's a good idea before you start your DSA process to do some, again, office planning, a pre-inspection planning to identify landscape units such as forests and wetlands. You want to identify those areas because you're going to have to put your plots in very specific locations. And I mentioned in the previous slide that the length of the project is important here. If it's less than 400 meters, you need at least one plot every 100 meters. So for that kind of a 400 meter long right of way, you would have to have at least 5 plots. If it's more than 400 meters long, you have to hit every representative mapping unit, so forest or wetland or agricultural setting, and you have to have at least 1 plot per mapping unit, and at least 1 plot every 800 meters. Again, you don't have to do the whole thing, but you have to be cognizant of what you're inspecting, where you're setting up your plots, and make sure that you're meeting those minimal requirements. Moreover, if you have different landowners or properties with the structure that have been removed, you have to look at all the properties with at least 1 or more structures on it. And the point again here, you have to look at all mapping units. Can't just be agricultural lands or wetlands. You have to cover all the bases here. Brian told me to put a cat on here, a kitten. Because it's cute and it wraps everything up. It's nice to look at, just like this report. You know now that there are several kinds of power lines. They may all need to be decommissioned eventually, and that's the goal here. Alberta's reclamation processing criteria do apply to power lines as well. Any kind of work in or near wetlands that could affect the wetlands are covered under the Water Act and requires the input of an authenticating wetland professional. And this document that came out earlier this year specifies very specifics on the removal, backfilling, and vegetation reestablishment of these particular areas, and make sure that your reclamation process has been successful and covers all the different land uses. And I think I have one more. Yes, again, I thank Brian for covering the first part of the presentation. And if you need to contact us, well, you can send us an email or ask us questions either, I guess, after this talk or a little bit later on during this conference. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Marcus and Brian. Appreciate the presentation. I don't see any questions popping up right away, but I have one. It might be a little naive, but is a DSA equivalent to an ESA? Are we talking the same language?
That's a good question. That's yeah, definitely valid. DSA is a detailed site assessment, and that's for reclamation. So you're going to be assessing your landscape, your soils, and your vegetation parameters to see if you reclaim things properly and they meet equivalent land capability and, you know, kind of match the surrounding landscape. An ESA is an environmental site assessment. Generally, we have, you know, ESA phase 1 and phase 2, and those are usually for determining if you have contamination at a site. So the phase 1 ESA is you do like a historical, usually file review, site visit, and ESA phase 2 is you would do a more intrusive sampling, like taking soil or groundwater samples.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that.
Basically.
Great clarification. I know us on the East Coast, we don't really use DSAs, I don't think, but maybe we'll hear more about that from our next speaker, which is also you, Brian, and Premi Mohammed from Alberta Environment and Parks. So thank you very much, Marcus, for your part of this presentation. We'll turn things back over to Brian and Premi.
Thank you.
Is that working, Todd? Okay, there we go.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, thanks, Marcus. Yeah, thanks, Todd. Just want to say, show my screen. We're good? Can everyone see it?
Yeah, you're good now. Thank you.
There's so many things popping up in this video game. I've never played it before.
You're doing well. You might break the record.
I hope, right? I want to get the top score. That's, you know, keep trying. Maybe I'll come back in the next presentation. No, so yeah, thanks again to the ESAA, and just want to say thanks to our staff and stakeholders who contributed input to the remedial action plan guide. And also thanks specifically to Norm Sawatsky and Jan Quinlan, and of course, Premi, who is presenting during this right after me, so let's go. So we are going to speak a little bit about what are remedial action plans. I'm going to talk about some basic requirements, some technical considerations. Premi is going to talk about a review of the RAP and the RSC form that's been diligently worked on for quite a while now, and then maybe a little summary at the end. So a RAP, the basic ingredients, we kind of want to know what's there, what will be done, and by when. And more specifically, the Remedial Action Plan, or RAP, is intended to be a brief outline of how and when contamination will be remediated following a substance release. It builds on and summarizes information contained in the Record of Site Condition form, or RSC form. Once a substance release has been reported, the person responsible must develop a detailed understanding of site conditions and contaminants of potential concern, and you need to determine a course of action and timelines to meet our Alberta Tier 1 or Tier 2 guidelines for soil and groundwater. If a substance release has not been remediated to meet Tier 1 or Tier 2 within 2 years of discovering the release, the remediation regulation requires the person responsible to submit a remedial action plan that's acceptable to the director. When a site has been fully remediated within 2 years, you don't need to do a remedial action plan, not required. So next, if you look down, this kind of the tree, it shows the relationship between some of our contaminated sites documents. So remedial action plans fall kind of over in the bottom right there. So some requirements. The remediation regulation requires timelines for collecting information to be included within the RAP. A Phase 2 environmental site assessment and the Record of Site Condition form are required to support your RAP submission by providing information on the status of the site. Any department reference numbers that are issued for the substance release, you need to track those. So these are probably things like a file reference number, incident number, or site numbers. They need to be included in your Record of Site Condition form for reference and identification purposes. People might call them different things depending on when they were assigned or, historically, but generally that's what we're looking for. If any of those are missing, the Record of Site Condition form and the overall remedial action plan are considered incomplete. So you also need to verify the release has been reported to the department and has received a release reporting reference number. That's why that's needed. You need to make a note, are there any affected third parties? Has any contamination moved off site? Were any affected third parties contacted and informed of the site condition and content of the RAP? You need delineation in all media, it needs to be demonstrated. Delineation is considered complete when measured concentrations are consistently less than what is provided in the Tier 1 and Tier 2 guidelines. Phase 2 environmental site assessment reports must clearly indicate complete horizontal and vertical delineation of contaminants of concern on and off site. And we have a contaminated sites policy framework, and that has options for managing your contaminated sites. So you can remediate to Alberta Tier 1, which is our generic remediation guidelines. You can remediate to Alberta Tier 2, those are modified guidelines that are specific to your site. And exposure control, that's risk management through exposure barriers and or administrative controls, but you'll also need a full risk management plan. Some more basic requirements. Source control, the person responsible must explain what source control measures have already been completed to ensure human health and the environment are being protected. All sources of contaminants must be completely remediated or controlled. If source control can't be demonstrated, a plan to achieve source control must be provided. You need to let us know what types of remedial activities are you doing or planning. You need to explain when the remedial action plan will be implemented, including remediation commencement and completion dates. And if you are using a risk management plan under the exposure control plan option, if there is an accepted RMP for your site, you need to reference that risk management plan info in your RAP form. If there's an accepted risk management plan for the entire site, no RAP is required. Moving right along, technical considerations. The department's Contaminated Sites Policy Framework that came out in 2014 provides options for managing contaminated sites, like I mentioned before, so remediation to Tier 1 or Tier 2 or exposure control. A conceptual site model, or CSM, is a visual representation and a written description of the physical, chemical, biological processes occurring or that have occurred at a site, and they are, as they relate to the contamination and contaminant migration. Those are generally part of your phase 2 ESA. And we want to know what contaminants are there or what contaminants are there. You want to identify all contaminants, exposure pathways, and receptors. So things like domestic water wells, aquifers, dugouts, you know, things that you don't want nasty stuff to run into and party with. If a full delineation has not been achieved, a plan with a timeline for assessment must be provided. Vertical and horizontal delineation in all media, aka soil and groundwater, must be demonstrated, including offsite impacts as mentioned before. Some more technical considerations to consider. When preparing a remedial action plan, the environmental professional must verify and provide current land use designations. You want to keep in mind that there may be multiple land use designations that apply to different portions of the area affected by a release, including possibly more sensitive land uses, and thus the land uses of adjacent properties must also be documented. A source that is as identified in Alberta Tier 1 guidelines is anything that adds contaminant mass to the environment. Contaminants could continue to affect soil and groundwater and act as sources of further contamination, which is nasty. And sources of contamination can further degrade environmental quality by contributing to an increase in the extent and amount of contamination in the environment over time. Any observed direct adverse effects must be evaluated and managed regardless of contaminant concentration. Observing new or additional adverse effects following remediation indicates that the work was insufficient and further work is required, which means that the remedial action plan needs to be re-evaluated and or amended. So hopefully you don't have any remaining contamination after you've planned and remediated everything. But if there is, you need to go back and check that out. That's all for me. Premi is up next. I'm not sure if you just want me to click through the slides or if Premi is going to switch over screens, but I'm game either way.
Remy, are you going to join us on screen?
Yeah, I haven't got access to a webcam, but
Okay,
I can pop up my desktop here. Hang on, if I get control.
Yeah, we're working on that. Is that your presentation there that we see? Remedial action plan and record of site condition? Okay.
Yeah. You just, okay, is that visible?
Yes, carry on. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, as Brian mentioned, I'm kind of working on the guts of the form, and that's been, as some of you know, kind of a long process. We initially started with, oh, how come I can't move my slides? Oh, there we go. So yeah, we've had people asking why change the form, but I don't think anyone is going to agree that the form was actually working well. So our current version is the MS Word version, which dates to about 2009. And what people were doing usually was copying that into a PDF and embedding it in the larger report. So the main reason we changed the form is for data management, and the second reason is to make it easier for users to use. So this, hopefully, this update will be easier for both of us. It was hard to track the form itself. You had to flip through these reports, you know, digitally, to try to find where people had put the form, if they'd stuck it in an appendix or just stuck it into the middle somewhere or put it out somewhere on its own. And on our end, we couldn't query the data except manually. So somebody had to physically go through, find it, and recopy the information. So it wasn't working terribly well as it was intended to work, which is kind of as a summary or snapshot of a site that staff could look at to help triage or make site decisions and decide how much detail they needed to go into when reviewing the report. So we also had comments from staff that it was so easy to miss fields on the Word version or fill things out incorrectly, and it couldn't correct you, and there wasn't much guidance or clarity on certain fields. So the new version hopefully will get around almost all of that. The program that we're using allows for a lot more flexibility, and it's a very powerful form-making program, really. So the new version will allow us to harvest entered data into the database, and we'll have validation rules so that you can't fill out a form wrong, and should have the ability to let you make a remedial action plan right in the form. Click, click. So yeah, we're planning on putting quite a few safety features on it as well. That it can't be modified after it's been signed, so people can't mess with it on our end after it's been submitted. This was originally based actually on the AER form, kind of like a rally car. You take it down to the steel frame and you rebuild it and you put the sponsorship stickers on it. But with input from our operations group, we streamlined it slightly for AEP activities rather than focusing on oil and gas. There's fewer fields to fill out now. The form is pretty short initially. It gets longer based on the type of site that you're reporting. And we're going to be using digital signatures on it, similar again to the AER form. So we should have better and faster decision making on sites, because it should allow us to look at a clearer snapshot. So let me just back out of here. So I wanted to kind of show the form as we've got it at the moment. I've got it open in Adobe rather than the program that it's being made in. So if it comes up with a bunch of debugging issues, I apologize in advance. So this is what it looks like at the moment. We're about 80-ish% done with all the coding and whatnot. And by we, I mean I. So this is taking up a lot of my time. But you can see we're planning on tracking using the file number of the form, as Brian mentioned, because we want to keep it consistent. We want it to be trackable to a site. So we don't want things to get lost in the system, and we want people to be able to update the form rather than having to fill out a new one whenever there's a requirement for one. And a lot of stuff deliberately is made with drop-down menus so that you don't have to type in stuff every time. Date fields, we're getting weirdly inconsistent date formats with stuff. So in this case, it forces you, to pick a date. And we're going to go through and finish all the rest of this too. Mandatory fields are going to be marked off so that people know which ones they have to fill out. Which professional organization you're going to be in is going to be an option as well. Supposing it is your first one, let's see what we've got. So a lot of this is to kind of get around specific errors that we've seen when moving data into our internal sites. So for example, plan block lot you can type in, but for the legal land description, we were finding that a single typo in the legal could cause the back end of our system to not be able to retrieve the file or do anything with it. So now that's all drop downs, which yay. And same with the municipality, which helps our regional staff figure out who to send it to for detailed information if needed. And it's the form gets longer if you need it, and it doesn't so much if you don't. So it really depends on what type of site you're dealing with. So the goal for this form really is making it easy for the user to fill out. We really don't want to increase the regulatory burden on people filling this out, and we want to get good quality data and data that's useful for our internal staff. So yeah, I think that's about it. As Brian mentioned, we've kind of shaken it and sorted out what we need to make decisions with. So we took out a lot of what was in the previous forum, and now we just kind of have what's really essential to flag a site as something that staff might need to get some more information on or spend some more time with. So this is a forum that's intended to really help with a first cut. So, you know, here's the major receptors that we're worried about, right? Like surface water, water wells, dugout, groundwater, residential areas. We ask about the delineation. If you need a RAP for the site, you get the option to create one. Oops, right, forgot that's going to cause a JavaScript error, sorry. But yeah, it's, you know, just, it's not an onerous form, it's even in terms of the RAP. We just want to know the basics pretty much. So next steps for us are going to be finalizing and testing the form, which is going to be over the next couple weeks, and then training of our internal staff on using the form and harvesting the data correctly and making sure it gets into our database and that everything is secure and centralized. And again, similar to the AER form, we're going to be offering some kind of training. I don't think that's been decided yet. And as Brian mentioned, there's going to be guidance documentation on using the form, submitting the form, correctly filling it out. If there's any areas of the form that are unclear, there'll be help in that document. So I think the main takeaway here is that this is not a new requirement. You already had to submit the record of site condition and under certain conditions. This is just a new and hopefully more streamlined form that will take less time to fill out and will be more useful for everybody.
Great, thank you, Premi and Brian. Appreciate those presentations. We've got a number of questions, so I'll start with the top from Robert Weidman. What types of contaminated sites, there I am, thank you again. What types of contaminated sites need to go through this process? Do sites with historical contamination as well, well centers and a sump from an old spill, etc., need to be reported for possible completion of a RAP? Premi or Brian, you want to take that one?
Sorry, I was just writing something down. Hear me?
Yep.
Well, if it's well sites, that would go through the Alberta Energy Regulator. And otherwise, this is, it applies to sites that are after the remediation regulation came out. So I forget the date, January 1st, 2019. So it applies to those.
Okay. Other question from Ada Wang. Brian, could you talk more on the affected third-party requirement in the RAP process? What exact requirements / proof are required to be shown in RAP?
You need to state, are they there? We can't collect a ton of personal info on people, but you do need to state if there are. So it basically becomes a box on the form that gets checked off. So you do that and then show that you have contacted them. And then if there's an issue down the road, they have something to go back on and see.
Okay. Another question, are existing or ongoing issues grandfathered, or will a RAP have to be submitted no matter where you are in the remedial process?
Generally, I don't think we do grandfathering on stuff. Like I said before, I think this is like the first question. So it's for sites since the remediation regulation had came out.
So since what was the date?
I think it was January 1st, 2019.
Okay. Another question from Brett Reynolds. What is the purpose of the record of site condition? If for risk prioritization, will the new form provide a risk ranking similar to the National Classification System for Contaminated Sites adopted by CCME?
Yes, I believe that is the purpose. It helps staff triage sites and see where the most serious issues are and address those right away.
Okay.
Yeah, I can also, I guess, comment. This came up when we were developing the form, and I think it was, is there going to be a public-facing risk ranking that people will be able to see and that companies will be able to see? As far as we know, not in this version. If there's a desire for that, we can possibly talk about that for future versions.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Michelle Taylor, is the AEP going to accept the record of site condition instead of a RAP for sample sites like AER?
No. Sorry, not to be blunt. It might depend. If you don't need to do a remedial action plan for your site, then you still need to do a record of site condition. But one doesn't replace the other. It's just basically the remedial action plan gets tagged on as extra pages to the record of site condition.
Okay, and Rob Hoffman is asking, Premi, when will the new record of site condition form be available for general use? You mentioned you're still working on the programming.
Yes, the goal is this January, like this upcoming January.
Okay, lots of questions coming in. Yeah, go ahead, Brian. You want to answer that? No. Okay.
Sorry. No. What?
So I heard something in the background. I thought you wanted to chime in on that. I have another question here from Carolyn Carruthers. She said she didn't see an option for substation or transformer boxes. Is there going to be an option in the form for this, and how will it be handled for urban areas?
Oh, yeah, I didn't show all of the options that are in the form. There's a ton of hidden stuff there. So if you actually do have one of those, you'll be able to get to it where it's approved. I only showed a couple of things there. Okay.
Well, we're gonna cut it off there. Our next speakers are coming up. Thank you very much, Premi and Brian. Appreciate that. Lots of information. I think your details were shared on the screen for those of you who have other questions. But we're going to move right into Matthew Gardner and Grant Walsum, who are going to talk the dirt on excess soils in Canada. So they're going to give us a cross-country review on what's going on with excess soils. I see Grant there, his 30th anniversary of XCG. He knows this topic intimately. And there's Matt from Wilmington Shire. So I'll turn this over to you guys.
Thank you, Todd, and thank you to Isa and Joe for having us. I am in some portal of my MacBook, and I'm trying to figure this out. I just need to go through system preferences. Apologies, one sec.
In the meantime, Grant, why don't you regale us with stories of excess soils? You're on mute.
Show.
No, we still can't see you.
Right.
Hear you. There you go.
Here I am. I just wanted to talk about how much I miss being in Banff. This is probably the first time in about 12 or 13 years that I haven't had a chance to come out there, and I really miss it. And I see the weather's a little cool, but and I want to talk about as well that excess soil in Ontario, although it's going to be a big issue coming up. Part of it is really driven by the developments that has happened in the last number of years in Toronto, and I think this is really what's driven Ontario to go to an extra step that maybe some of the other provinces haven't contemplated or really need to go. But having said that, Matt, are you ready? No?
I am ready to talk. It forced me to quit go-to meeting, which I probably don't want to do. So what I suggest is we just roll without the slides, unfortunately, and we'll just be two talking heads, which is fine because Grant has a beautiful head, and we'll make sure the slides are available for everybody after the program. So let's do it that way. Apologies, everybody. Okay, so Todd, thank you. Isa, Joe, thank you. My name is Matt Gardner. As Todd said,
It's Joe. If you want, we can take a nano minute and you can try logging in and logging back out if that'll get your
let me do it quickly.
up.
Okay, let me try. Thank you.
That's a great suggestion, Joe. And I just want to echo what Grant was saying about missing things in Banff. But apparently there's a lot of snow up there. So we might have had some delays in this opening session with people transporting themselves to Banff. So,
And shoveling.
yeah.
I just want, well, if we have a minute, I can talk about as well that although the Ministry of Environment in Ontario has come through with this new regulation and all the tools that came with it, you know, about 8 years ago, they came up with the best management practices for excess soil management in the province. And that really came out of a lot of bad press that were coming and some nefarious operations that were going on where you know, illegal dumping was going on or misrepresentation of soil quality and people looking for loopholes on where to take development soils and putting it on, say, aerodromes and airports and private airports and so forth. So really this came as a result of that. But the industry's really taken it well and has given the ministry a lot of really good feedback. And you know, when the best management practices came out, it really didn't have enough teeth and enough instruction on how to really deal with this. And the industry actually pushed for regulation. So we're really happy that the ministry has obliged us on that and has given us some great things to work with on development and construction and so forth in the province of Ontario. Matt, you're ready.
Okay, everybody can see this the actual slide deck now.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, thanks, Grant. Apologies, thanks for the indulgence, everybody. So Grant may have just gone through, as I was out, some of his background. I want to start with that because it's important for context for everything that Grant's been doing on the excess soil front. Actually, both of us have done a number of presentations to industry, but Grant's been really integral through ONEA in Ontario, the Ontario Environmental Industry Association, to work with not just the regulator, the MECP, but also stakeholders across the province to not only give inputs about what has become a separate set of laws on excess soil in Ontario, but also to spread the word to the public about and stakeholders about what this all means as it comes in phases over the next few years in Ontario. So Grant's going to elaborate on that and how it was actually industry that promulgated or pushed for regulation as opposed to just guidance in Ontario. But we're also going to do what we promised, and that is take a quick cross-country review of what is akin to excess soil regulation, law, and also guidance in just 6 of the provinces in Canada, because these are the 6 that we've chosen, probably because I would say they have the most importance to the members of ESA, but also because they have the most akin to an excess soil set of laws and guidance of the provinces. So we're going to go through those. And then we'll talk about key issues and takeaways that are of most importance and interest to the folks who joined us today. So generally speaking, what is excess soil? It's soil that has been excavated, often during construction activities, and then it's transported from a source site to either a processing site, an interim site, or to a reuse site for final placement. In BC, we have the Contaminated Sites Regulation under the Environmental Management Act, and both of these govern the process for tracking, for transporting and depositing of soil from contaminated sites. And under the regulation in BC, we have an important tool. It's called a relocation agreement, where if you're relocating soil from a source site to a receiving site, you need this agreement in hand if the soil is contaminated by even one substance, if not more than one substance, in concentrations that exceed the limits for soil set out in Schedule 3.1 of the reg. Another interesting point is that back in January 2019, the regulator, the BC Ministry of Environment Climate Change Strategy, issued actually a policy recommendation with a series of proposed amendments to the Act and to the regulation. And these amendments actually include removing what I just spoke to, the relocation agreements tool or mechanism, and instead introducing notification and certification requirements. And these amendments would provide for something that we call administrative monetary penalties as lawyers, which are probably the most akin to a ticket as opposed to a conviction with a fine, but there are still payments of fines that are required under that regime. It's just not as serious as some of the fines that you've heard about from through presentations before. But that's not yet law. Those amendments have not become law yet, so we'll see if that comes into fruition. And then finally, interestingly, in BC, there's disposal of soil in very prescribed and very narrow limited circumstances to the sea. There's only really one site currently, as far as I'm aware, through our research in BC, that's from which you can actually dispose of soil, contaminated soil, to the sea, and that's in Point Grey in BC. But it's very restrictive. The circumstances under which you are allowed to actually dispose of contaminated soil in BC at this Point Grey site are subject to international law. They're subject to the federal Canadian Environmental Protection Act, Impact Assessment Act, potentially. And really, it's only there as a tool if there's no other alternative, if there's no appropriate land disposal available. So very narrow circumstances, but interesting nonetheless. Alberta. So in Alberta, we have excess soil, not explicitly regulated as quote unquote excess soil like it is in Ontario, but it's regulated under the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act, PIA, and its waste control regulation. The Act prohibits the disposal of contaminated soil, which is deemed waste, except at an approved waste management facility, a landfill that's approved, or in accordance with another type of authorization through the director at AEP. The regulation also prohibits disposing of waste in any place other than a waste management facility or through an authorization by the director, unless you fall into one of three exceptions. One of them is if you're a farmer, you can dispose of agricultural waste potentially on your own land. In certain circumstances, you can deposit earth, quote unquote, and you can deposit inert waste for use for reclamation purposes. Here are 4 guidelines that Alberta Environment and Parks applies to excess soil insofar as it relates to contaminated soil and contaminated sites, including from construction projects on the slide. Just another interesting point, in 2007, Alberta published what's called its Too Good to Waste strategy. And it's an interesting document because it sets out ways that industry, and it's guidance only, but sets out ways that industry in Alberta can try to avoid disposing of costly disposal of soil and instead reuse it or be able to minimize the amount that's going to landfill. And that includes, interestingly, hydrovac waste, so from daylighting activities. And one of the best management practices under that strategy is to avoid generating waste by using as little water as possible and not over excavating during hydrovac processes. So that's interesting. Manitoba. So in Manitoba, similar to Alberta and BC, there are the contaminated sites regimes in place, of course. The Contaminated Sites Remediation Regulation and the Contaminated Sites Remediation Act govern the registration, the remediation, the management of contaminated sites in Manitoba. And under the Act, contamination includes the presence of contaminated soil. So like BC, these laws really cover excess soil and contaminated soil, but within the contaminated sites regime and not outside of it. Similar to Alberta, there are also guidelines in Manitoba, including the Treatment and Disposal of Petroleum Contaminated Soil Guideline, and the criteria for acceptance of contaminated soil at waste disposal grounds, which are waste disposal facilities, as they're called in Manitoba. Quebec is very interesting. So in Quebec, impacted soil is subject to various regulations under Quebec's Environmental Quality Act, and the 3 regulations are on the slide. And these regulations together make up the excess soil legal regime in Quebec and set out concentration limits for contaminants, prohibitions for dumping on certain sites or placing soil on certain sites, and the storing of excavated excess soil. If soil is disposed in contraventions of these regs, the owner, the lessee, or any person in charge of the site where the soils were disposed of is required to take necessary measures to ensure that the soils are disposed of in compliance with the regulations. So if you're the receiving site, you have to make sure that you adhere to the requirements of these regulations. And also, again, a theme here, in Quebec, there are actually two tiers of penalties that may be applicable to these regulations if there is a contravention. One is the lesser a pathway of administrative monetary penalties, AMPs, and then there are also full-blown prosecutions with fines, and in rare cases, for only the most egregious actors and circumstances, imprisonment. Over to New Brunswick briefly. So New Brunswick's Clean Environment Act sets out requirements and order-making powers for impacted sites, and most specific to excess soil, I would say, are New Brunswick's guidance documents. So the guideline for the management of contaminated sites outlines guidance for assessing, managing, completing site investigations and remediation. And then, interestingly, New Brunswick has a one-page clean fill guideline. It's short but sweet, and sets out some guidance for clean fill and how to reuse it. And then last, interestingly, there's four potential types of laws that we've listed on the slide, but the watercourse alteration regulation is interesting because it regulates the placement of fill within 30 meters of a watercourse. So that's New Brunswick. So Grant and I are going to dive a bit deeper into Ontario because Ontario has, as you can see, quite a bit of new law and a little bit of guidance that is explicitly specific to excess soil, outside of waste, but dovetails with waste, outside of the brownfields contaminated sites regime, but dovetails with it. So these are the components. We have the regulation itself, the on-site and excess soil management regulation. We have amendments that were made, some of them just because there was an opportunity to make amendments to the record of site condition brownfields regulation and that process, but at the same time, some amendments to that regulation to allow for excess soil to play into when you can't get a record of site condition in Ontario. Changes to and amendments to Ontario's waste regulations, two of them, the main one and the and one that pertains to really transport of soil. And so I would say on the whole, the waste management regulations have been changed to allow for less stringent requirements. Certain scenarios where you may not need an actual approval from the ministry in Ontario to be able to haul excess soil, even if it is deemed, which it is at the time of hauling, quote unquote, waste. There are rules for soil management, and in the same document, excess soil quality standards, which are basically the generic standards that apply for excess soil, a new set of tables that mirror but are slightly different than and mostly more stringent, lower concentration limits than our site condition standards as they exist for brownfield redevelopment in Ontario. We have the beneficial reuse assessment tool known as the BRAT for qualified persons, environmental consultants like Grant, to generate site-specific standards that may allow for higher concentrations of contaminants than as set out in the excess soil quality standards, the generic standards. And then last but not least, we have a rationale document for reuse of excess soil at reuse sites, which is guidance, not law. So if you can distill into four buckets what the regulation really requires, and it's tough to do because it is complicated, but in my mind, you can do it in four buckets as follows. You can say that the regulation really designates excess soil as waste, and when excess soil is no longer waste. There are notice filing requirements under the regulation, having to file a notice for more complicated, larger volume soil projects on what's called the Environmental Site Registry, which is a public portal, open portal, government portal for finding records of site condition, but now also, as of Jan 1, 2022, for notices about excess soil and the requirements for certain bigger projects, more complicated projects, which will be publicly available. Third, there are requirements, of course, for soil testing, documentation, QP reports. So Grant providing potentially as many as 4 different reports that may be required for bigger projects, and then tracking as well. And last but not least, requirements for excavating, for storing, for treatment, for processing, for transporting and depositing excess soil. So what is excess soil? I'm taking us through very briefly the key definitions because they're very important. And the first one is, how is excess soil actually defined? Well, under this Ontario excess soil regulation, it's defined as soil, not surprisingly, or soil mixed with rock that has been excavated as part of a project and removed from the project area for the project. And so excavated soil itself isn't necessarily excess soil. It's only excess soil once it leaves the project area, the site itself. project is very broadly defined. I'm just going to read one of the 4 different types of what falls within project. The first bucket is any form of development or site alteration. So it's very broad. It's all encompassing. If you are excavating soil at a property, whether it's for even the purpose of digging out your pool, for example, all the way up to a big municipality's infrastructure project or a transit line or something like that, those are all projects within the excess soil regime. And then last but not least, most important, is the definition of what is a project leader, who is really target number 1 or the main person under the regulation for the purpose of liability, which we'll speak to shortly. And the definition of project leader is the person or persons who are ultimately responsible for making decisions relating to the planning and implementation of the project. So when is excess soil waste? Well, excess soil waste is deemed waste when, and it triggers all of the requirements under the excess soil regime when it starts from the project area and then is transported either through a processing facility, class 1 or class 2, soil bank storage sites or soil processing sites, or a local waste transfer facility, depending on the requirements. And it's a bit complicated. And then once it's ready, after processing, to the reuse site for final beneficial reuse and placement. Or it can go straight from project area to the reuse site. Okay, so that's the first requirement or piece about when excess soil is waste and when it may no longer be deemed waste. And it's not until it's actually meeting either the generic standards for excess soil quality or the BRAT risk-based standard that it can be finally deposited at the reuse site and no longer deemed waste. And if you follow all of the rules, arguably you are no longer potentially liable. You don't have exposure for that soil material once it's at that reuse site and you've done everything you need to do under the reg. The owner and operator of the reuse site has to consent in writing to that final placement of the excess soil at the reuse site. And the excess soil must be dry soil, or it must be processed if it's liquid soil, again, like hydrovac waste, for example, to become dry soil before it's finally placed at the reuse site. So I'm going to turn it over now to Grant to speak to some of the QP specific, qualified person consultant specific combinations and permutations and details of the regulation. Over to you, Grant.
Thanks, Matt. You can take a rest now. Have a drink of water.
Thank you.
The biggest thing switching for the excess soil regulation in Ontario is switching the responsibility. So it used to be on if you were receiving soil that you were responsible to make sure that the soil met a certain quality. That is now different. It has now been reversed, and all the responsibility of the appropriate management of the excess soil is now on the shoulders of the project leader. The project leader can be an owner, developer, or on bigger projects, a general contractor. The qualified person doesn't have any of those responsibilities, but will be relied upon very heavily for assisting the project leader, initially with the characterization of the soil and documentation preparation. And as Matt had talked about, there could be up to 4 different documents that need to be prepared even before the shovel hits the ground. There are a couple of triggers for excess soil and when the projects need to be identified and filed on a provincial registry. First, if the project will create over 2,000 cubic meters or more of excess soil, where project planning activities, those 4 reports that Matt had talked about, and those need to be completed per the regulation and the rules. The second main trigger is whether or not the historical use of the property may have created a potential for contaminants, regardless of the volume. So, and I'll go over that in a minute, but really, whether or not a phase 1 or a phase 1 type report has identified that there is a potential for contaminants, or if the property would fall under an enhanced investigation property where, it used to have an industrial use, garages, bulk liquid dispensers, and the dirty old dry cleaners. Next slide, Matt, please. So when you're comparing the analytical results of the soil, there's a couple of things, standards that you need to use, and Matt had touched upon those new standards. Those new standards would only be applicable if you're creating more than 350 cubic meters of soil and you're going to accept that on your property. If it's less than that, you would still use the the OREG 15304 standards, which we've been using in the province for over 15 years in assessing contamination. It's when sites are going to accept more than 350 cubic meters, the new set of generic tables that Matt had identified earlier have been established, and those are in the rules document. You can use those for comparison for the generic version. If you would like to explore maybe something that could be a little higher to be deposited at your site, there's a modified risk assessment platform that was developed by the Environment Ministry called the BRAT, which Matt has also identified. Or you could complete a full risk assessment. So for the beneficial reuse of the soil and the reuse of the site. Those 4 reports that Matt had touched upon earlier, I'll go through them very quickly. The assessment of past uses, which is very similar to a standard phase 1 ESA. Some of those things that would be in a phase 1, such as building conditions and those types of things, are not necessarily covered in the assessment of past uses. However, the operations that would have happened on there. So it's a little bit of a scale down. We call it a phase 1 light, but does look at the history of the property and the potentials for contaminants. Once you've identified whether those potentials are there and you need to go to the next step and do some site assessment and sampling and analysis, a sampling analysis plan would need to be derived. And then that would be used to frame your sampling and analysis on site. And then the results of that would be summarized in a soil characterization report, which would be similar to a phase 2 ESA. Once all that's done, we can characterize what that soil is and what types of sites it can go to, whether it's a table 2 site, which is for potable groundwater use, a table 3 type site, which is for non-potable use, such as the City of Toronto, who gets their water from Lake Ontario. So once we know what that type of soil is, we can look at an excess soil destination report and prepare that, and that's where you assess a number of applicable locations where that soil may go. That could be an iterative process, and that should be a living document, because as you get closer to the actual removal of the soil from your site, you may end up finding additional locations that may be better for you in terms of locations, distance to the site, so we can reduce greenhouse gases, tipping fees, all of those types of things, and capacity to take your soil. So those are the 4 types of reports that may be created and should be living documents if things change throughout the project. Those all 4 reports will be prepared by the QP and will be through a very stringent regulatory regime that's outlined in the rules document. When you're characterizing the excess soil, there's a set of number of samples that need to be collected and analyzed depending on the volume of soil that's going to be relocated. The number of samples are also dictated by whether the soil being sampled is in situ in place, such as test pitting or drilling, or if you're sampling previously excavated stockpiles. They are slightly different in terms of the number of samples per the volume of soil, and those are outlined on the slide. Further, there's a set of minimum analytical tests that need to be completed. Things like pH, metals and hydrides, BTEX and PHCs form those minimum standards that you need to compare to and have analyzed. If there are other potential contaminants of concern that have been identified in your assessment of past uses, they need to be also analyzed, such as VOCs or PAHs. Beyond that, because we're not deriving groundwater assessments in the reuse sites, leachate testing becomes a very big part of that. And leachate analysis needs to be done on 10% of the samples collected and analyzed, chosen based on the samples with the highest bulk concentrations, which could be difficult because you can't predetermine which samples are going to be done for leachate analysis until your bulk samples are done. Leachate procedures are modified SPLP methods that the ministry has approved. So because of the impact that the excess soil regulation could have on development in municipalities and so forth, and infrastructure activities, a large number of exemptions for projects around infrastructure projects. And infrastructure projects are anything like highways, railways, public transit, pipelines, sewers, water lines, electricity, telecoms, and properties and structures that support those infrastructure sources. Exemptions do have been developed for those, like moving soil between infrastructure projects owned and operated by the same proponent. So you may be a city digging sewer lines where you're going to excavate the soil from one sewer line. You may use it as backfilling another sewer line in your same city. That would be an example between infrastructure projects. You can also move soil to a temporary storage site or a Class 2 soil management facility that's owned by the same infrastructure company or public body. And that can occur without compliance approval, provided the storage and management on that site are within a series of rules, such as only storing it there for 2 years. Other things like emergency repairs to the infrastructure wouldn't require any front-end planning activities and sampling and analysis ahead of time. There are also exemptions on the storage limits for infrastructure projects and exemptions for requirements of registration on the provincial registry of those projects. So there are many other nuances within the regulation, but I didn't want to go through that because we could probably take up the entire 2 days of RemTech programming talking about those. But I wanted to provide you with some of the technical aspects that we're looking for. So Matt and I are going to talk about who the liability may be around. So the liability, Matt, you ready to go?
Yeah, you're on mute, Matt.
Me. There we go. Sorry, the organizer had me muted there. Okay, let's do this briefly because I'm mindful of time. Sorry for the mucking around at the start, pardon the pun. So Grant, why don't I just speak to this, and then I'd like to speak to the landfilling piece too, and then we'll go through key takeaways.
Go for it, bud.
So the project leader, like I said before, is very important. That definition is, again, I'll just repeat it, the persons who are ultimately responsible for the whole process of excess soil. And really the project leader can be anybody who is in charge of, or it could be multiple people who are in charge of and have management control over the excess soil process, starting with the project owner, who could be a municipality, who could be your swimming pool house owner, anybody in between, all the way through, responsible all the way through to the final placement of the soil at that reuse site. Thankfully for Grant and for many others who are on right now, the project leader is not a consultant, but the consultants are there, of course, to assist the project leaders, those who are involved and are the proponents of the project for the purpose of everything that Grant just went through. So again, the liability issue, when you compare it to the waste regime in Ontario, which has closure, there's an actual section under Ontario's Environmental Protection Act that gives you liability closure. There isn't that same mechanism in the excess soil regime, but the best way to ensure that you are compliant and not exposed to future liability is to make sure that you do all of the steps, take all the steps required until that soil is finally placed for reuse for beneficial purposes at that reuse site, and then you can sleep easy at night. So that's how the regime works. So Grant, let's talk about, the landfilling piece, because this is important, and it's something that Grant found and brought to my attention because he's a legend, way back in the back pages of this very dense rules, the soil rules document. So Grant, maybe just take us through what happens on January 1, 2025, because that's the date where there are restrictions on being able to landfill excess soil. Until then, you can landfill all soil in Ontario, but once the hammer comes down Jan 1, 2025, it's a different process.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of, through the varied development industries, remediation and so forth, the liability closure that comes with sending your soil to landfill has been very attractive, especially for, say, gas stations. Making sure that that liability closure happens by sending that material to a landfill. You don't get that same liability closure when you're sending it to a reuse site and reusing the material. So the province has given landfills a period of time to adjust to that and to pivot a little bit. We all know that landfills use soil for daily cover, for final cover, roads, berms, etc. For those types of operations, excess soil still can be used. However, you cannot landfill for disposal soil that meets Table 2 generic for residential properties. If it's that level or cleaner, which would be fairly safe soil, you cannot send that for disposal. The landfill still may use that for their operations, such as berms and cover and roads, but they can't use it for disposal. So that's really the biggest switch that's going on. They have in the minds of the province and the industry in Ontario, soil that meets that threshold is clean and should be able to be reused in a beneficial manner as opposed to filling up our landfill space.
Grant, some key takeaways on your end.
Yeah, really what's really happening, and we've been talking about this for a while, is with the excess soil regulation in Ontario, early planning on your projects is really needed. You need to do your full characterization ahead of the shovel hitting the ground and making sure that you've got a full understanding of what kind of soil you have, how much you have, and where it can go, and ensuring that the proper documentation for due diligence has been created. Teamwork with communications at all levels of the project, and then the responsible management of the materials by the project leader as opposed to a contractor, a hauler, or the poor guy who may be receiving soil that has been misrepresented. But in every situation, they may be different and they should be reevaluated at those types. But it's a great new program that we have in Ontario. We're looking forward to implementation come January 1st. How about you, Matt? What are your key takeaways?
Yeah, thank you, Grant. It's complicated. We've seen certainly in BC, definitely in Ontario, and also in Quebec that there's pretty comprehensive legislation in place. We know that Ontario has it actually specifically called excess soil. It's coming into phases over the next few years. There's going to be a lot, I know right now there's a lot of adaptation going on in the industry to try to make sure that everyone is compliant. And the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks in Ontario is actually changing dates as we go, particularly because of the pandemic, for phasing in of the excess soil regime because it is so complicated. But other provinces certainly have legislation that applies to what we call excess soil under their waste laws. So that was pretty clear with the 6th province review that we did today. And we'll see how it unfolds in Ontario. We'll see if there are changes in BC coming up that actually come into force. And we'll see if other provinces follow suit with a somewhat unique, separate excess soil regime.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate that. As Matt mentioned, we are running out of time, but your contact information is there. Reach out to both Grant and Matt with any questions. Just so everybody knows, coming up on December 8th is the Excess Soil Symposium that is going to be happening in Ontario. And we'll probably cover all of this and then get into more detail on some of the other landfilling and environmental regulations related to excess soil. So December 8th, virtual, of course, and you'll probably see both Grant and Matt on the podium there for that. So without further ado, thank you, Matt and Grant again. And thank you, Ivy Soul, for sponsoring this session. We're going to move into our next speakers, Jackie Stevens and Michelle Heffernan. Jackie's from Wilmsden Shire and Michelle is with Trace Associates, and they're on the screen now, and we're going to be talking about environmental practice in 2020, part 2, staying on the tightrope. Over to you.
Great, thanks. I'm not sure if you can see me or
Yes, we can. We're good.
Okay, and the slides are up as well?
Looks like it, yes.
Perfect, because I only see the slides, so it's a little disconcerting, but I think, Michelle, you're on as well?
Yep.
Oh. Michelle, we don't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Perfect, great. Well, thanks, Todd, and thanks to ISA for having us here today. So Jacqueline and I are going to be presenting on environmental practice in 2020, staying on the tightrope. And this is a part 2 of a presentation that we provided in EnviroTech earlier this year. And if you weren't able to attend EnviroTech and see that presentation, don't worry, you're not missing anything. We are just continuing from that because we had so many things to discuss last time. So we, can you change, oh, perfect. Oh, we're at the end.
We're at the end.
There we go. Great. So maybe we'll just start with a little intro. So my name is Michelle Heffernan. I work at Trace Associates. I am a partner and environmental scientist at Trace. We work in reclamation, remediation, natural sciences for all industries.
And I'm Jackie Stevens. I'm a lawyer with Wilms & Shire Environmental Lawyers. And as you'll see on our slides, we have a little disclaimer that our presentation is general information and is not intended to provide either technical or legal advice. And we definitely recommend for you to reach out to both your technical and legal team if any of the information you hear today causes you pause. So with that, I'll pass it over to Michelle to get us started.
Great, thanks, Jackie. So just give you a little overview of our planned discussion today. So many environmental professionals in this day and age are finding that we need to operate a little bit differently with the curveballs that are being thrown our way, whether that's the recession or COVID or having to work remotely. And with those pressures, we're changing how we operate, and in some cases, changing how we're operating can open ourselves up to some unwanted liability. We're finding that it can be difficult to meet the expectations of regulators and landowners, or in some scenarios, the public, who maybe have high expectations, and also meet the expectations of the client, who maybe have limited budgets and can only approve a limited scope. So it ends up being a balance for us where we're trying to collect enough data and provide enough information so that we're able to give sound advice and act in a professionally prudent manner and not end up slipping off that proverbial tightrope into liability. So today we wanted to discuss some of those potential foot slips, and we've structured the presentation similar to the EnviroTech presentation, where we're going to have a little bit of a discussion. So I'm going to present a few scenarios that might be encountered in my role as an environmental scientist, and then Jackie will respond and provide some insight on the legal front. So what we'll do is we'll start with an example case study and discuss some of the foot slips that we might encounter with that particular case study. And that'll include kind of the who, what, and when of notifying landowners, and also off-site plume migration. And then we'll discuss, when remediating a site, how clean is clean, and we'll close out the presentation with a little bit of discussion on using digital stamps and signatures. So on that note, let's jump into the case study. So this particular site is it was a well site that was spud in 1959. A gas plant was subsequently constructed on the site between 1960 and 1962. And as I'm sure you can imagine, since 1959 and the change in operational status of the site, there's been lots of different infrastructure over the years, and the licensee has changed a few times, which is pretty typical for most oil and gas sites in Alberta, I'd say. Currently on site, there's a compressor station, and the boundaries of that compressor station completely overlap with the boundaries of the former gas plant lease. The site is located in private agricultural land. There's a surface lease with the landowner, private landowner, so the operators do not own the land. And the site is fenced. Great. So to complicate things further, the compressor station operator has a sublease with the former gas plant operator. So there's a little bit of confusion over who's responsible for what on site. We've done some recent assessment and determined that there are several areas of soil and groundwater impacts. Most notably, there's a former burn pit in the southeast corner of the site. And we suspect, based on the information that we have, that it's unrelated to the compressor, and it's more likely related to the former gas plant that was on site. Based on the location of the impacts and the boreholes that we could advance at the corner of the site, we have high suspicion that the impacts are migrating off-site to the southeast. We can only get within about 5 meters of that fence line because of ground disturbance setbacks, so we can't confirm or deny if it's off-site, but we suspect it is. So given that suspicion for off-site impacts, our next step would typically be to drill additional boreholes outside of the site to try and delineate that plume. And in order to do so, we'd have to request permission to drill off-site and get some temporary workspace from the landowner. So my first question to you, Jackie, would be, when requesting that workspace, is there any requirement to inform the landowner of those suspected impacts?
So it's a good question, and you'll see this same first bullet on a number of slides. It depends, and there's a number of key pieces of information that you need to review in order to make an assessment of what level of information and notification needs to take place. Based on your case study, you said you don't know that it is actually outside of the fence, but you suspect it to be. So one of the first things to do is have a look at your surface lease or other lease, if it's not a surface lease situation, about what obligations exist concerning potential liability, reporting, remediation, reclamation, and abandonment. And I know that surface leases are generally pretty generic and void of a lot of detail. Other leases that may be in place between a landlord and a tenant, or a landowner and a user, land user, may be much more specific, and we'll get to the how clean is clean piece at the end of the presentation. But it's certainly very important to have an understanding of what those obligations are. You also need to know what your regulatory obligations are in terms of your type of site, the contamination you found, what your next steps might be. But I think generally it's important to provide a general scope of work necessary to obtain that permission for the workspace. You're likely going to provide the number of wells, their approximate locations, and a key thing to add to that is what condition you're going to leave the land in after the sampling has taken place. You don't know at this point that it is impacted. So you may have a relationship with the landowner such that they would understand, and you could advise them that this is a suspicion. But until you know, at least for now, and getting permission to do further work, I think less is probably more within the reasonableness of the lease and your regulatory requirements.
Okay, great. So keeping with that landowner notification theme, if we do determine that there is indeed offsite contamination, would you suggest that the landowner or potentially neighboring landowners, when do you suggest that they be informed, and what information would need to be provided?
So again, it depends. And I go back to the two key points I made in the last slide is some of this will be based on what your lease says and what the regulatory requirements are. Certainly, if you're pressing forward to indicate to an affected landowner what is going on, you should have a good understanding of the impacts and probably the source, or your at least theories in terms of a source that are causing those impacts to either the property itself or to offsite. You certainly have to consider any reporting obligations, and as we talked about at RemTech, the first of those is, as the consultant, is to report to your client. And then there may be other obligations as well, but that is another consideration that you as consultant with information have to discuss with your client. In terms of a landowner, so the entity that you have the lease with, depending on those lease requirements, you may provide the data and you may provide a work plan that's going to address contamination. We know in many instances leases talk about reclamation or remediation, and it usually happens at the end of a lease, which may be years away. So it may be that your initial step will be to continue to monitor what is happening outside of the leased area and providing some intermittent or interim updates as things progress forward. If in fact the contamination is moved off-site, you now might need to advise a neighbor about what is going on or what is happening. And you need to consider a few questions. Who should do the notifying? Is it the tenant, the leaseholder? Is it the landowner, or is it the consultant, the lawyer? You need to consider who's going to actually make that communication. The timing of when that should happen. Is it partway through your assessment process? Is it once you've figured it out? And then you're also going to consider what information to provide. And you may want to suggest that they hire a consultant to review the information, the data, and to assess. And maybe if your intent is actually to take care of the problem and clean it up right away or within a short period of time, maybe you're also providing a work plan to the neighbor and their consultant to have a look at. There's certainly strategy involved, and especially in terms of perhaps a limitation period that might run, that come into figuring out when to notify and with what information. And in most jurisdictions, there's a 2-year limitation period to bring claims once someone knows of contamination at their property. There are exceptions in each province, and I don't propose to go into those here, but it may be that you want to, the landowner wants to control the process. So there's a reason to notify and start that limitation period running, such that a neighbor may have to take steps to bring a lawsuit far sooner than they otherwise might have. So it's important to engage your technical and your legal team in order to consider all of the different aspects of reaching out and considering what that strategy may be.
Right, and in our reporting, we often provide lots of information, interpretation, data evaluation, historical assessment information, and in some scenarios, I think when providing the information to the landowner, that all that detail may be a little excessive, and instead just providing some of the data rather than the interpretations might be more appropriate.
And it certainly also creates room for that discussion about what needs to happen next as well. So feeding things slowly in small chunks might be easier, and it creates a situation where you can create a strategy around how you want to respond and the timing of that, for sure.
Right, and often without having done any remediation yet, or maybe in the process of drilling boreholes, we don't necessarily have all the answers. So those interpretations are often just good enough for the client or for planning for next steps, but not really a clear picture for that landowner. So that's great. Okay, so let's move on to our next slide there. So if in our scenario, if you recall, we suspect that the contamination is related to previous site operator related to that gas plant that formerly was operating on site. If that can be proven that the former operator is actually responsible for the source, is there any legal action that can be taken in order to make them be responsible for the cleanup?
So again, it depends, and you need to have a look at what those regulatory requirements are, as well as your lease requirements. You need to also be able to review some technical information, and hopefully you have baseline information that will help you determine and confirm that what you're finding today was actually caused by a prior land user. So if at the beginning of a lease, which is something we recommend as you're entering into a lease, is to make sure that a baseline is done. It draws that line in the sand between what was done before and what then is done after that time frame. And that can be very helpful to creating that proof, as you indicate, that evidence of use of the land. So that's a key piece to be able to tie who used the land and who caused what contamination. Certainly as a first step, you might write to that prior land user with a demand letter and asking them to come in and do the cleanup if you're comfortable with that, or perhaps pay for the cleanup, having had a work plan developed so you know what steps need to be taken. You may also need to consider a lawsuit, and it's a lawsuit against the prior land user, but I make a note here because maybe it's actually the landowner who has to bring that lawsuit. They may have a better position based on the civil causes of action that are available. But they may also be restricted as to what the lease said and what that former land user had entered into, what agreement they had entered into with the landowner prior to your involvement at the site. So that's where having your technical and legal team involved and having these discussions and strategies prior to simply pushing forward will assist. And it may be that the current land user can bring a claim, but they may not have, as I said, the best position as being just a subsequent land user rather than being the landowner that is impacted. Unless, of course, the land user, the current land user, is the one that might end up on the hook to pay for the cleanup of that particular contamination that was found.
Right. Okay. So with respect to the case study, I heard it depends. Every scenario is probably a little bit different. Make sure you know your surface lease requirements, make sure you know your regulations, and ask for advice, technical and legal, when necessary.
Absolutely. That's the key to the whole process of how to come to appropriate strategy and resolution of these types of issues.
So that covers our case study then. Somewhat related, dealing with contaminated sites and remediation. We typically need to ask the question, what are suitable soil and groundwater quality endpoints? And are the guidelines always sufficient, or can liability remain? So it leads to that next question for Jackie: how clean is clean?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, and I was actually doing some reviewing for another matter that I'm working on, looking back at what was of concern in the early 2000s. And in the early 2000s, how clean is clean was still, or was originally, a consideration. And we have some case law that helps us. We usually look to our leases to find out what it is a tenant is supposed to do at the end of a lease or during a lease. But sometimes leases aren't very clear, or they're even silent on these types of issues. Sometimes because the people who are writing the leases don't necessarily have environmental issues at the forefront of their thinking as they're drafting the commercial document that's going to deal with the use of the property and payment of rent and you know, who might be responsible for things. They may not specifically have thought about environmental cleanup obligations. So what we've seen, and I've listed a few cases here and I'll touch on them very briefly, but what we've seen as a general rule is that where a lease is unclear or silent, the courts generally interpret these things very broadly and imply cleanup obligations, even though they're not written into a lease. And of the 5 cases that are listed, if we go back to the Alberta Court of Queen's Bench case in 1994 called Darmac, interestingly, at that point, the court basically said, in this commercial world, unless a lease provides otherwise, they're going to imply a term that you're supposed to return land uncontaminated. So that was Darmac back in 1994. I mean, that's kind of the beginning of when we were seeing a lot of activity in the environmental realm or sphere. So then following that, in West Fair, this was a Manitoba case where it changed the rules a little bit, not uncontaminated, but basically said, as long as the cleanup, it's sufficient for the cleanup to be done to the regulatory standards. So unless you could show that the property was pristine, and that's often unlikely to, you're unlikely to be able to do that, then the regulatory standards are what is appropriate and what is reasonable. And then we have some other cases. Tompkin Mews, the lease was absolutely silent on environmental concerns, and it involved actually an assignment of a lease to another entity. And that entity was actually found to be responsible for the former tenant's contamination, because the lease said you're not to injure the property and you're to repair and maintain the property. So then we have a case, Alberta 2020, just this year, where it's a little interesting. There was a gas bar in place for a very long time under an old lease, and then a new lease was entered into. The property was sold, another lease was entered into, but it had the same tenant for most of that time. And the court basically said, and implied some terms from previous leases to say, tenant, you're required to clean up, and not just to the current lease standard, but actually to the 1977 lease timeframe. And when it was in effect, it said that the tenant had to clean up. And then the court said, but what's interesting is in 2004, your lease talked about cleaning up hazardous substances. And then while your 2009 lease didn't specifically speak to that, they implied the term that the tenant was responsible for paying those remediation costs. So as a general rule, we have that if it's not in the lease, you're still probably going to be expected to clean up. And whether that's to the original property state is hard to say, but at least to the regulatory standards is going to be the appropriate level of cleanup that's needed.
Okay, so if our surface leases do not have any specification for how clean it should be, we'd be safe to assume that regulatory standards would be the benchmark.
Yeah, and I think a couple of the generic type surface leases I've read basically say that you're required to reclamation and abandonment, and that's going to be within the realm of the applicable legislation. So yeah, you're looking at regulatory standards, what you would be required to do under the regulation as a minimum.
Right. Okay. Great. So we wanted to close out the discussion on signatures and stamps. Since many of us are working remotely these days and becoming more accustomed to operating paperless, digitally signing and stamping reports is becoming the norm. And hoping, Jackie, that you can provide a little bit of guidance around what legal concerns might exist when using e-signatures or applying our stamps digitally.
Sorry to interrupt, Michelle and Jackie. We don't have a lot of time, so perhaps you can do this really quick.
I got 3 points. One is that as soon as you sign off on a work product, you are responsible for it, and you've either prepared that work product or you have supervised the person who has prepared it. Once you sign it, you're responsible. In terms of authenticating, that's when you're putting your digital stamp or your physical stamp. What is interesting is that an electronic signature for some professional organizations is not just your signature scanned and PDF'd. You actually have to have a certified signature, and that's something that's key in the APEGA authentication practice standard. And while you have to look at your own professional body to understand what the requirements are, I do suggest that you have a look at the APEGA authentication practice standard, which I believe comes into effect at the beginning of November. It's quite detailed. It's quite good, and it has good explanation of how to do this and how to ensure that your signature is safe. And I put one note up here that says you may not actually be allowed to have your administrative staff apply your digital stamp and signature. So you do need to look into whether that's appropriate.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much for that. Let's put up the next slide with your contact information so people know how to get you and get a hold of you, ask any questions. But we're going to move right on. Thank you again, Michelle and Jackie. Great to see you both, and hopefully see you at the Brownie Awards coming up on the 24th. But next speaker is Chidima Thompson of Borden Ladner Gervais. and she's going to speak to us on managing environmental obligations and implementing the SCC Redwater decision. So over to you. Chidima, I think you're ready to go.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. I echo all the thanks of the previous presenters, Isa and Joe, and everybody else who have been working tirelessly to make this a success this year. I know how difficult it is to host a show this big virtually. Anything can go wrong, so it's like a time-ticking bomb. But anyway, we are making the most of it, and I will dive right into the presentation. Joe, can I have my slides now?
You have to share them from your desktop. Launch
Okay.
PowerPoint.
Okay. I am waiting for share my screen.
While we're waiting for that, for those of you watching remotely, which everybody is, obviously, you'll see my setup today. I'm standing, and my computer is raised on a stack of books, all signed
There we
books
go.
from Isa. We'll turn things over to Chidima.
Is it coming?
Yeah, it's loading.
Okay, perfect. Can everybody see it now?
Yes, we're good. Thank you.
Okay. So I would have to do the thing that you taught everybody else. Is it all good?
If you can just close the WebEx screen there. Yeah, great.
This one?
Just drag it over. Don't close that.
Just drag it over.
Is it better?
Yeah, that should work. If you go full screen with your presentation, I think we'll be fine.
If you click the button on your presentation that says in the top left that says display settings, and swap presenter view on that. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So sorry about that. That's the virtual world. So I'm going to be speaking on managing environmental obligations and implementing the SCC Redwater decision and kind of updating us as to where we are today. Disclaimer, this is not legal advice. And here is my little roadmap. We all remember Redwater very well. And this is just, I have about a couple of slides just to refresh our memories as to what the principles are, because it's from the principles that we go directly to understand what the case law updates are. And then there have been some legislative amendments coming out of figuring out how to implement the Supreme Court of Canada decision, and also the recent policies we're seeing from various levels of government in the era of COVID, and also funding coupled with that. I'm pretty sure most of us already have projects coming out of that COVID funding, so we'll get to talk about it later towards the end of the slides. So the SCC Redwater decision refresher. So as we all remember, Redwater Energy Corporation was the one that went under at some point, and what was applicable once a licensee in Alberta it's insolvent is the BIA applies, as well as all the whole regulatory regime that applies to oil and gas facilities and well sites in Alberta. So as it would be, the appointed receiver / trustee at the time, GTL, disclaimed about 107 assets out of 127 that were licensed to Redwater. So the AER and the Orphan Well Association sought orders compelling the trustee to fulfill Redwater's statutory environmental obligations. So issue went to court, Queen's Bench, Court of Appeal, and then eventually to Supreme Court of Canada. So the issue basically was whether the trustee / receiver had the ability to disclaim or renounce uneconomic assets, property. And two, what was the priority of the regulator's environmental orders? including payment of security deposits to address licensees' environmental obligations. Because when you're insolvent, you're dealing with a federal statute, the BIA, which already has its own priority scheme. So of course, when it came out in 2019, early 2019, it was a 5-2 split, the majority overturning all of the previous decisions of the Alberta courts. And basically what the Supreme Court of Canada said at the time was, yes, the receiver could disclaim property under the BIA, but however, that only applied to protect the trustee and the receiver's personal liability. The liabilities remain in the estate of the bankrupt. Then to the second question, the Supreme Court of Canada looked at the real nature of environmental obligations and said, these may or may not be financial obligations provable in bankruptcy. So they have to apply a test to figure out whether indeed the environmental obligations that issue before them was financial obligations and then a claim provable in bankruptcy. So if it's not, then it has priority. If it is, that's a different question. So the court also applied the paramountcy test. It's a constitutional doctrine and determined that in that particular case, that the paramountcy doctrine does not apply, that the Alberta's oil and gas regulatory regime can comfortably coexist with the priority regime in the BIA. So like I said, applying that test, super priority of environmental obligations is not automatic. You have to apply the three-part test to determine whether an environmental obligation amounts to a claim provable in bankruptcy. And the test basically is there must be a creditor. There must be a debt or a liability or an obligation to a creditor. So that creditor is underlined, as we all remember. Somebody has to be a creditor. So the debt or liability or obligation must have been incurred before the person becomes insolvent. Then the third is the monetary value. It must be possible to attach a monetary value to this debt or liability or obligation. And this was a test that existed already in a case called the Abitibi-Water, Abitibi, I call it for short. So looking at this, the Supreme Court of Canada at the time kind of, went through, we've been waiting for this for a long time because there was a Alberta Court of Appeal case in 1991 called the Northern Badger that has started this, that the regulator is not a creditor. So everybody has been waiting for like a confirmation as to what this really means. So the Supreme Court used this opportunity to clarify the nature of the regulator's claims during insolvency. And the Supreme Court said the regulator is not a creditor when it is enforcing a public duty. And when it is trying to enforce a public duty, is not a creditor to the individual or the corporation that is subject to that duty. So in seeking to enforce a bankrupt's end-of-life obligations, the regulator is acting in the public interest for the public good. And also in terms of the third test, which is the monetary value, the court said it must be sufficiently certain that the regulator will perform this whatever it is. In our case, is environmental work. It could be some other thing that amounts to money and then wants to seek reimbursement. So that's how that third test is applied. So how has this been applied today? So when I made this presentation a while ago, I believe it was in 2019 RemTech or Envirotech, I can't remember which one, but I did, and I kind of, people were speculating at the time, how would this apply? It was a lot of chaos in the industry, oil and gas industry, as to how this will all fit together, the economy and all whatnot. And I did make my own speculations at the time that this principle of the public good and the regulator not being a creditor may be extrapolated from just environmental obligations and oil and gas into other things. And what did we see not too long after that? This is what it resulted. And the first case we saw is Wing Re, which is nothing to do with oil and gas, nothing to do with environmental obligations. This was 2019 Ontario case where the Ontario Securities Commission was dealing with a bankrupt who was engaged in an insider trading, and the OSC issued penalties, issued a cease order, and required the bankrupt to pay administrative penalties for violating that cease order. And the bankrupt was arguing that it was not a claim provable in bankruptcy, or rather that it shouldn't have priority because of its bankruptcy. And the court said no and applied the three-part test and decided exactly the same thing that the Supreme Court said in Redwater, that the OSC was acting as not as a creditor, but was acting to enforce securities law. So the cease trade violation order was not a claim provable in bankruptcy. So this is confirmation that that principle holds firm in different other things, not just environmental obligations. We might see more of it. So the second one is, this was something I also talked about last year. I raised this as to remediation and reclamation services opportunities, even though it sounded so gloom and doom at the time the Supreme Court decision came out for the energy industry, and I get that. But I said there would likely be service opportunities, more service opportunities for the environmental services professionals. But I said, however, it's important to remember or to watch as to who is engaging the work and who will pay the bill. So is it the insolvent? Is it the receiver or the trustee? Is it the regulator? And most recently, it might as well be the OWA, which is Orphan Well Association, because down the road in my presentation, you'll see that things have changed a little bit, especially in Alberta. And also the WIPs, JVPs. WIPs are working interest participants and joint venture partners, basically. So in many of these oil and gas facilities, they are always done in joint venture forms, and they're always partners, working interest participants who are also on the record of the regulator. The licensee is ultimately on the hook, but when the licensee is insolvent, guess who else is down the line getting it right away? The WIPs. So this case also came out just right after Redwater came out, Supreme Court came out. It was a receivership commenced way before Redwater and had been ongoing for 17 months. So under the law at the time, which was the Alberta Court of Appeal decision, which said that the secure creditors would have priority, not the regulator. So that's the law at the time. The receiver was able to renounce some of the assets and sold good assets, and then the renounced assets were still there. Tried to sell them, they couldn't. Nobody wanted to buy renounced liabilities. So, but they were able to raise up to $11 million. And they were in serious discussions with the AER. They eventually reached an agreement with the AER at the time regarding the allocation of this $11 million. So the receiver applied eventually down the road to be partially discharged and to transfer and the renounced assets to the OWA for remediation and reclamation. So the three oil and gas companies sought an adjournment trying to block the receiver from being partially discharged. And they wanted to look at the list of the renounced assets and dig into it and probably bring more application, but they just wanted to stall it on the grounds that the Supreme Court's super priority principle was not applied because the receiver had not made room in this 11 million on how to fund the abandonment and reclamation obligations of those renounced assets going back to the OWA. So these are WIPs. They're going to get it. If the receiver, if it's not taken care of at this point in time, they will be on the hook for those renounced assets. And also as industry participants who are funding the OWA and also paying their orphan levy, they just make these arguments, but directly it's on them as WIPs. So they are saying, hold on a bit, you haven't applied the Supreme Court's decision in Redwater. So courts, hold on a bit, we need to go back there and apply that principle. And the court said, nope, that's not what Redwater said. Receiver's application was granted to be partially discharged. The request for adjournment was dismissed. And the reason being that the WIPs were trying to hijack, the court said the WIPs were trying to hijack the proceedings by trying to use the regulator's powers to get themselves priority, typically. So the WIPs hoped to convince the court and the AER that any funds realized from the estate should be applied to the end-of-life obligations of these renounced assets, therefore reducing the risk and the amount of the WIP's responsibilities for such obligations. So in effect, the whips were proposing to the court and the AER to give them priority, to give their own interest priority. And they, of course, their interest is unsecured and is also contingent because those renounced assets are not requiring remediation or reclamation right away. So it's contingent and unsecured, but they want to usurp the regulatory authority based on the Redwater principle against the debtors and get priority for that. So the court said that while AER's orders may have super priority, the unsecured non-regulator creditors do not have super priority. So they argued that the OWA could have requested an adjournment too, but the court said the OWA did not request an adjournment and the OWA is not the regulator. So, and I put this little red thing here just to say, based on the amendment that I'm going to talk about shortly, are we sure this hasn't changed? This is the 2019 case where in 2020, lots of legislative amendments that happened this year between June and July, expanding the OWA's powers. So this might not really be accurate anymore. I don't know, it needs analysis until we see. That's when we'll begin to know what actually the OWA can or can't do. But for now, the powers are there. So here is the legislative amendments I just talked about. On June 15, 2020, that Liabilities Management Statutes Amendment Act came into force. It's part of the new suite of policies to be announced. The government said they were going to announce, which eventually came out, but it's part of the holistic framework that the government of Alberta was going to use to manage environmental liabilities from exploration to post-closure, while at the same time ensuring that industry is able to meet its obligations in a manageable way. So this was how it was introduced at the House before it was passed. So this act typically amended the Oil and Gas Conservation Act and the Pipeline Act. And they usually go hand in hand. You amend this one, you amend that one. And what they did was to impose additional duties for licensees and approval holders. And if, in the interest of time, I am not going to take you through all of it. When you get my slides, you can figure out, read more of what those amendments are. But basically, it tries to be proactive or preventative, sort of, rather than leaving it towards the back end. So, for example, the new section 26.2 of the OGCA now provides this new duty for licensees and approval holder to provide reasonable care and measures to prevent impairment or damage in respect of the well facility, well site, or facility site. So that throughout the new OGCA, you see all this further explanation or inclusion of well site and facility site. Before it used to be like wells and facilities. Now they make sure they capture sites. So continuing on it, then on the amendments, the OWA can now operate assets as well. Before they couldn't. The only thing they could do, the only authority, delegated authority they had, was just to go in there, suspend or abandon orphan wells and facilities. But now they could operate an asset and undertake production, but with the consent of mineral rights holders. For the purposes of this presentation, that's not super important. Another thing that is important that I want to point out in the amendments is that the OWA can now undertake remediation activities under Part 5 of the PIA, which is under the release of substances. Before, they used to just simply do suspension, abandonment, and reclamation. Now, remediation under Part 5, they can do that. And the orphan funds can cover that as well. So, so there is a big expansion of the OWA's duties and powers and functions as to what they can do. And the orphan funds can cover all of that. Section 70 was amended too. So also that act enabled the regulations, of course, that authorized the existence of the OWA, which is the Orphan Fund Delegated Administration's regulations, enabled the amendment of that regulation as well. So just as I said, the OWA has more powers now. It also has this significant power to enter into agreements with any person for any reason related to the exercise and carrying out of its delegated powers, duties, and functions. So qualifying agreements that the OWA can enter into include an agreement with WIPS for suspension, abandonment, remediation, and reclamation, an agreement to purchase, lease, or obtain access to lands for the purposes of suspension, abandonment, remediation, or reclamation, and also an agreement providing for a reasonable likelihood of reducing the number of or preventing the occurrence of orphan wells and facilities. This last one, I think it's being kind of proactive, and also even to take off wells and facilities off of their hands, or being proactive before, just to reduce the number of orphan wells and facilities. And we know that before now they have the regulated directed transfer. If you want to get an orphan well and facility to use it for something else, they have the regulator directed transfer. It's not an easy process. It was very cumbersome. So I'm hoping that this agreement that the OWA can now enter would facilitate and help people, or project proponents who want to use some of these orphan wells and facilities, take it off their hands and use it for something else, like waste disposal. This will be possible through this agreement. So the good thing is that, like I said, the orphan funds can be used to cover some of these things that the OWA can now do. So in addition to legislative amendments, there are also new policies on liability management that was just announced in July. We haven't seen the details yet, but this is the skeleton of it. It's going to be, this is to manage, liability management framework as we used to know it, which was the LLR. This is potentially what is coming. The first one is called Licensee Capability Assessment System. Last year, it was called the Corporate Health Assessment. That's the little that we knew of it. It's going to replace the LLR. Is going to help to assess the capabilities of oil and gas operators to meet regulatory liability obligations prior to even receiving regulatory approvals. So it's like a health check as to who is worthy to receive this, the approvals, to hold a license, to hold an approval. Then the second thing that is in the piping is proactive support for struggling operators. It's called the Licensee Special Action. And there is also the Inventory Reduction Program, which is going to be a 5-year rolling spending targets for reclamation that every active site operator must meet. This includes the ABC that we already know that is ongoing. The area-based closure program is ongoing, it includes that, but this one is 5 years. There's going to be a landowner opt-in. This is an interesting one. It's new, and I'll tell you why in a moment, because I believe that this is tied with the federal government funding. It is new. It is a new opening because I've been involved in a lot of inquiries where landowners are wondering when the wells on their lands will be cleaned up, and the OWA has their own priority of how they do things. And of course, it's the sickest first. It's like the emerge when you go to a hospital, sickest first. Anyway, so this is going to be big to have landowners opt in to have a mechanism for them to nominate sites for cleanup. Then there's also addressing the legacy and post-closure sites. So this one is historical contaminated sites and legacy sites and post-closure going forward, how to monitor it. The government said that the panel will be established to determine how to move this one forward. Of course, we discussed about expanding the mandate of the OWA, and we already discussed that in previous slides. The orphan levy came out September 10, 2020, and what it is this year is it went up to 65 million for the 2020-2021 year. It was 60 million in the previous year, but according to the OWA's annual reports, 3.4 million was not collected because of insolvencies. Who is surprised? So I don't even know in the COVID era what is going to become of this 65 million. But it's not all bad news. There is some form of funding. Okay, before we get to the funding, my thoughts about the opportunities for environmental services professionals from all these legislative amendments. Some of them are proactive now. I think there's going to be activities there assisting licensees in complying with all these new obligations, the new duty of care, not to damage and to repair. So it's all defined in the amended OGCA as to what that is. So I believe that there will be work here for environmental services professionals, proactive and preventive consulting and software services, assisting licensees in creating new approaches to minimizing environmental risks, and assisting licensees in monitoring and implementing abandonment and reclamation strategies, and of course being creative. And there's so much new technologies out there now, lots of inquiries, a lot of files asking for regulatory guidance on how to use this new technology to use former oil and gas wells to do hydro, or to do waste disposal. So there are new really cool stuff technology on how to revamp the energy sector, basically to build in low carbon energy and recycling all these facilities. So there's going to be work there, and it's the people in this conference that would probably benefit from all of this. So here is the COVID funding. Most of us are already benefiting from this funding that the federal government provided in the heat of COVID, just to sustain jobs by cleaning up the environment in the energy sector. So Alberta received up to $1 billion, and Saskatchewan received $400 million, and British Columbia $120. This is how the government is supporting the energy industry, by cleaning up. And the OWA is receiving a loan of $200 million to also support its work, but the OWA is a loan, so it's going to be fully repaid. So of course, there are strings attached to this funding. Like I said, as part of this funding, local landowners will have the ability to nominate and prioritize wells for remediation. So that's why we see in the Alberta framework, there is that landowner opt-in. So that's coming from this funding. And also, of course, Alberta committed to implement strengthened regulation to significantly reduce the future prospect of new orphan wells. And that's why we're seeing the amendment of the OGCA and the Pipeline Act. So the funding program will have oversight from federal and provincial committee. The federal government will ensure municipal and indigenous engagements. This one is big for municipalities. I do get inquiries also about things happen during elections, scrambling, landowners complaining about unclean sites, and it's all horror stories. So now the municipalities will be involved in also this cleanup process. So
we're going to have to stop you there, Chidima. I'm sorry, we're running out of time.
And this is the end, actually. So this is my last slide. These are business opportunities, just my thoughts on them, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions. My contact is right there.
Thank you very much. Thank you for lots of detail on the SEC Redwater decision. Lots of interesting information. I'm sure people will follow up with you. So thank you very much for your presentation. And before we break for lunch, I wanted to thank Bud and Ivy Soul for sponsoring this session. And behind me, you can't see it, but one of these photos is in this book. So as you all know, Joe has written a book. It is now a bestseller on Amazon. I'm very proud to be a friend of Joe and have a signed autographed book. And as I was mentioning earlier, I've got my computer propped up on probably about a dozen signed books I've gotten from RemTech over the years, but this is the most special one to me right now. So thanks, Joe. Thanks, Lorene. Thanks, Isa, for this amazing session. Again, all the speakers and the sponsors. And we'll see you next year, live in person. And so go have some lunch, have a good time this afternoon with the rest of the sessions, and we'll see you soon.